The dust hadn't even settled when they came for her ranch. 23 years old, orphaned, and drowning in debt she couldn't pay. Eliza Hartley watched the bank's men catalog everything her father had died protecting. $2,300. That's all it took to erase a lifetime. The foreclosure notice was being nailed to her porch when hoofbeats thundered down the road. A stranger in a weathered duster dismounted, his eyes hard as flint. How much does she owe? 3 words that would change everything. Before you find out what happens next, I invite you to stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale travels. The morning had started like any other kind of hell. Eliza Hartley stood at the kitchen window of the ranch house, her father's coffee cup still sitting on the shelf where he'd left it 6 months ago, a ring of dust gathering around its base like a monument to absence. Outside, the New Mexico sun was already beating down mercilessly on land so dry it had begun to crack like old leather. The well was running low, the cattle were thin. And the bank's letter, the third one, sat on the table behind her, its words burned into her memory, though she'd only read it once. Final notice. Amount due, $2,300. Failure to remit payment by October 15th will result in immediate seizure of property and assets. October 15th. Today. She'd known it was coming, had felt it approaching like a dust storm on the horizon, that sick inevitability of disaster you can see but can't outrun. For 4 months she'd scraped and scrambled, sold everything that wasn't nailed down, worked her fingers raw trying to keep the ranch running and make payments the bank would actually accept, but it was never enough. The drought had seen to that, and the cattle disease that swept through in August, and the fact that she was 23 years old, female, and alone in a territory that respected neither youth nor womanhood when it came to matters of money and land. Her father, Thomas Hartley, had built this ranch from nothing over 30 years, had carved out a life from soil and stubbornness, raised horses that were known 3 territories over for their stamina and spirit. He'd survived Apache raids, droughts, blizzards that killed livestock by the dozens. He'd survived everything except the simple, stupid accident of a spooked horse and a badly placed rock that had crushed his skull last March. And her mother, Sarah Hartley, had followed her husband into the ground just 2 months later, her heart apparently deciding it had no interest in a world without him in it, which left Eliza alone, orphaned, and inheriting not just a ranch, but a debt her father had taken on to expand the horse breeding operation, a gamble that would have paid off brilliantly if he'd lived long enough to see it through. She hadn't. The sound of wagon wheels crunching on the dry road pulled her from the window. Her stomach dropped like a stone down a well. They were here. 2 carriages, black as crows, with the territorial bank seal painted on their sides. She watched them roll up the long drive, dust billowing behind them in angry clouds. 4 men climbed out, 3 she didn't recognize, dressed in city suits despite the heat, and 1 she knew all too well. Vernon Hastings, the bank manager. A man whose smile never reached his eyes and whose handshake always felt like touching something dead. Eliza took a breath, squared her shoulders, and walked out onto the porch. The heat hit her like a physical thing, even though it wasn't yet 9 in the morning. The boards under her feet, boards her father had laid himself, creaked with a sound like grief. She stood at the top of the steps and waited, her hands clasped in front of her to keep them from shaking. Hastings approached first, removing his hat in a gesture that might have seemed respectful if not for the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice carrying across the yard with the particular kind of false sympathy people use when they're about to destroy your life. "I'm sorry it's come to this." "Are you?" Eliza heard herself say. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Something flickered across Hastings' face. Annoyance, maybe, or amusement. "The bank gave you every opportunity to settle this debt. Your father was a valued customer for many years. We extended him credit in good faith." "My father died trying to build something," Eliza said. "I've been trying to finish what he started." "With what capital?" Hastings spread his hands. "Miss Hartley, you're 4 months in arrears. The total amount owed, including interest and fees, now stands at $2,300. Do you have that sum?" The question hung in the air like a noose. "You know I don't," Eliza said quietly. "Then I'm afraid we have no choice but to proceed with foreclosure proceedings." Hastings gestured to the men behind him. Mr. Pembroke here is our assessor. He'll be cataloging the property and assets for auction. I'll need you to vacate the premises by sundown. The words hit her like bullets. Vacate. By sundown. This house where she'd been born, where her mother had taught her to read, where her father had told her stories by the fireplace about the old days, about building something that would last. All of it, gone by nightfall. This is my home, Eliza said, and hated how small her voice sounded. This is collateral, Hastings corrected, and as of today it belongs to the Territorial Bank. One of the other men, Pembroke apparently, was already pulling out a leather-bound ledger and a pencil. He looked around the property with the detached interest of someone cataloging furniture in a warehouse. The third man, younger, with a deputy's badge pinned to his vest, stood with his hand resting on his gun belt, as if Eliza might suddenly turn violent. The horses, she said suddenly. At least let me keep the horses. They're not part of the ranch proper. They're my breeding stock. My father kept separate books for the horse operation. Hastings smiled, and it was worse than if he'd frowned. Everything on this property is collateral, Miss Hartley. The horses, the cattle, the equipment, all of it will be sold at auction to satisfy the debt. If there's any surplus after the bank recoups its losses, you'll receive it, though I wouldn't count on there being much. Of course there wouldn't be. The bank would make sure of that. They'd undervalue everything, sell it to their associates for pennies on the dollar, and she'd be left with nothing, not even enough to buy a train ticket east. Eliza felt something crack inside her chest, some last fragile hope she'd been clutching finally splintering apart. How long do I have? She asked. Mr. Pembroke's assessment should take 3, perhaps 4 hours, Hastings said. I'll need you to remain on the premises during that time to answer any questions. After that, he shrugged. I suggest you take whatever personal effects you can carry and make arrangements for lodging elsewhere. The ranch house itself will be locked and secured. Where exactly am I supposed to go? That, Miss Hartley, is not the bank's concern. The casual cruelty of it took her breath away. She'd known Vernon Hastings for years, had seen him at church socials, at the 4th of July celebrations in town. Her father had played poker with him, and now he stood in her yard, dismantling her entire existence, and couldn't even be bothered to pretend he gave a damn. Pembroke was already walking toward the barn, his ledger open, making notes. The deputy remained near the carriages, watching Eliza with the bored expression of someone who'd done this before and would do it again. I'll need access to the house, Hastings said, to inventory the contents. Eliza wanted to tell him to go to hell, wanted to slam the door in his face and bar it and dare them to break it down. But that would only bring the deputy's gun into play, and then she wouldn't even have until sundown. She'd be hauled off to jail, and the outcome would be exactly the same. So she stepped aside. Hastings climbed the porch steps, his boots heavy on the wood. He paused at the door, glancing back at her. For what it's worth, he said, I did try to convince the board to extend you more time, but you're young, unmarried, with no male relatives to vouch for your capability. The bank can't afford to carry unprofitable accounts indefinitely. How generous of you to try, Eliza said flatly. Hastings' smile thinned. Bitterness won't improve your situation, Miss Hartley? He went inside. Through the open door, Eliza could hear him moving through the house. Her house, opening drawers, making notes, cataloging her life like it was inventory in a general store. She stood on the porch, paralyzed by a grief so huge it had nowhere to go. Around her, the ranch that had been her entire world continued its slow death. The windmill that needed repair creaked in the hot breeze. The fence line along the eastern pasture sagged where posts had rotted. The garden her mother had tended was a patch of brown stubble. Everything her father had built, everything he'd died trying to protect. Gone. In the distance, she could see Pembroke entering the barn. She knew what he'd find there. 8 horses, including 2 mares heavy with foal, and the stallion, Ranger, that her father had paid a small fortune for 3 years ago. Magnificent animals, every one of them. They'd be sold off individually, probably to buyers who didn't know the first thing about proper horse care. The breeding program her father had spent decades developing would be scattered to the winds. Eliza closed her eyes and tried to breathe through the tightness in her chest. This was how it ended then. Not with violence or drama, but with paperwork and assessments and polite men in suits dismantling everything piece by piece. Her father's legacy reduced to line items in a ledger. A sound made her open her eyes, a creaking from inside the house that meant Hastings was in her father's study now, going through his desk. She should probably be in there, making sure nothing was stolen, but she couldn't bring herself to watch. Couldn't stand the sight of strange hands touching her father's things. Instead, she walked down the porch steps and out into the yard, needing to move, needing to do something other than stand still and let this happen. The sun was climbing higher now, promising another scorching day. October in New Mexico was supposed to bring relief from summer's heat, but this year the drought had held on with stubborn determination. The sky was a hard, brittle blue, cloudless. No rain in sight. Just like there'd been no rain for months. Just like there was no rescue coming now. Eliza found herself walking toward the family cemetery, a small plot on a hill overlooking the ranch, enclosed by a wrought iron fence her father had commissioned from a blacksmith in Santa Fe. Her parents were buried there, side by side under matching headstones. Thomas Hartley, 1821 to 1886. Sarah Hartley, 1825 to 1886. She stood at the foot of their graves and wondered what they'd think if they could see this. Would her father be disappointed in her for failing to save his ranch? Would her mother tell her she'd done her best? "I'm sorry," Eliza whispered to the silent stones. "I tried. I really tried." The wind picked up, hot and dry, carrying dust across the hilltop. In the distance, she could hear Hastings calling out to Pembroke, their voices carrying across the empty land, coordinating, cataloging, destroying. She didn't know how long she stood there. Time had become strange, elastic. It felt like hours and seconds all at once. The sun beat down on her head. Sweat trickled down her back. Her throat was dry, but the thought of going back to the house for water, her house, that would soon belong to someone else, was unbearable. Finally, Hastings' voice cut through her paralysis. "Miss Hartley, I need you back at the house." She turned and saw him standing on the porch, waving impatiently. With leaden feet, she walked back down the hill. As she approached, she could see that Pembroke had returned from the barn, his ledger now filled with notes. The deputy had moved to the shade of one of the carriages, his hat tipped low over his face. "I need you to sign these documents," Hastings said, thrusting papers at her. Acknowledging receipt of the foreclosure notice and confirming the inventory assessment. Eliza looked at the papers without really seeing them. "And if I don't sign?" "Then the deputy will note your refusal, and the foreclosure will proceed anyway. The signature is a courtesy, Miss Hartley, not a requirement." Of course it was. She took the papers and the pencil Hastings offered. Her hand shook as she signed her name, Eliza Jane Hartley, on the indicated lines. Each signature felt like a small death. "There," Hastings said with satisfaction, taking the papers back. "That's settled then. Mr. Pembroke, do you have the final assessment?" "Preliminary figures put the total asset value at approximately $1,800, Pembroke said in a nasal voice. "Accounting for the condition of the structures, the livestock, and current market conditions. $1,800. For a ranch her father had spent 30 years building, for horses worth twice that if sold properly, for a house that had sheltered 3 generations. That will barely cover the principal debt," Hastings said, frowning. "What about the horses specifically? The breeding stock should command premium prices." "Not in this market," Pembroke said. "Droughts hit everyone hard. Nobody's buying luxury items like thoroughbred horses when they're struggling to feed the stock they have." Luxury items, that's what he called her father's life work. "Well, we'll have to take what we can get," Hastings said. He turned back to Eliza. "The auction will be held next Saturday in town. You're welcome to attend, though I imagine it won't be pleasant for you." "How considerate," Eliza said, her voice hollow. Hastings checked his pocket watch. "It's nearly noon. I think we're finished here. Miss Hartley, you have until sundown to remove your personal belongings. Anything left after that becomes property of the bank." 6 hours. She had 6 hours to sort through 23 years of life and decide what she could carry. "I'll need a wagon," she said, "to transport my things." "I'm afraid the wagon is part of the ranch assets," Hastings said, "already cataloged. Then how exactly am I supposed to? You can hire a wagon in town, or perhaps one of your neighbors would be willing to help. His tone suggested he doubted it. In this territory, helping someone the bank was foreclosing on was a good way to make yourself unpopular with the people who held everyone's mortgages. Eliza felt tears burning behind her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She would not cry in front of these men, would not give them that satisfaction. Is there anything else? She asked. I'll need the house keys before I leave. The house isn't locked. It will be. The bank will be installing new locks tomorrow. Hastings held out his hand expectantly. Eliza wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. She'd never locked her doors. Nobody out here did. But now the bank wanted keys, wanted to seal away her home like a tomb. I don't have keys, she said. We've never needed them. Hastings sighed as if this was a personal inconvenience. Then I'll have locks installed today. You'll need to complete your removal of personal effects within the next few hours. Before she could respond, a sound cut through the hot, still air, the sound of hoofbeats coming fast. Everyone turned to look down the road. A rider was approaching, pushing his horse hard, dust billowing up behind him like smoke. Even from a distance, Eliza could see he was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the kind of weathered duster that marked a man who spent more time on the trail than in town. The rider didn't slow as he approached. If anything, he urged his horse faster, thundering down the last stretch of road before hauling back on the reins in a spray of dirt and gravel. The horse, a magnificent bay gelding, danced sideways, snorting, as the rider swung down from the saddle with practiced ease. He was younger than Eliza had first thought, perhaps early 30s, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of storm clouds. His jaw was shadowed with several days' worth of beard, and his clothes, though dusty from travel, were of good quality. A gun belt rode low on his hips, the holster worn smooth from use. Well, Hastings said, recovering his composure. Can I help you, sir? The stranger ignored him. His eyes had found Eliza, and something in his expression, recognition, concern, made her breath catch. Are you Eliza Hartley? He asked. His voice was deep, with the faint accent of someone who'd been raised speaking Spanish before English. I am, she said, confused. Do I know you? No, ma'am, but I know of you. I've seen you in town. He looked around at the carriages, at Hastings and Pembroke and the deputy, and his jaw tightened. Is this a foreclosure? That's really none of your concern, Hastings said stiffly. This is bank business. I'm making it my concern. The stranger's hand rested casually near his gun belt, not threateningly, but noticeably. Miss Hartley, these men taking your ranch? Eliza found her voice. Yes, I owe the bank money, $2,300. I don't have it. The stranger's eyes, she could see now they were gray like winter rain, moved over her face, studying her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. $2,300, he repeated. That's the total amount? Plus fees and interest that will continue to accrue, Hastings interjected. Now, Mr. I don't believe I caught your name. Mercer, the stranger said. Caleb Mercer. He turned to Eliza. Ma'am, if you had the money right now, would that stop this? Would they leave? Well, yes, but how much exactly? Caleb cut in, looking at Hastings now. The bank manager's expression had gone carefully neutral. As I said, $2,300 plus, I heard you the first time. If I pay you that amount in full, right now, do these men leave and this woman keeps her ranch? A shocked silence fell over the yard. Hastings recovered first. Well, yes. If the debt were to be paid in full, the foreclosure would be suspended. But Mr. Mercer, I should tell you that I'm not asking for a history, Caleb said flatly. I'm asking if you take payment right now, do you leave? Yes, Hastings said, and Eliza could hear the skepticism in his voice. But Mr. Mercer, $2,300 is not a trivial sum. I hardly think... Caleb Mercer was already reaching into his saddlebag. Eliza watched, frozen, as he pulled out not one but two leather pouches, both heavy enough to make metallic clinking sounds as he moved. He walked past Hastings to where Pembroke stood with his ledger and dumped the contents of the first pouch onto the carriage's running board. Gold coins spilled out in a glittering cascade, catching the sun. Start counting, Caleb said. Pembroke stared at the money like he'd never seen coins before. Hastings pushed past him, his eyes wide. "This is... Where did you get this?" "None of your concern," Caleb said, echoing Hastings' own words back at him. "It's legal currency, isn't it? So count it." With shaking hands, Pembroke began sorting the coins into stacks. Eliza watched, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. This couldn't be happening. This stranger, this man she'd never met, couldn't possibly be paying off her debt. Things like this didn't happen. Not to her. Not today. But the coins kept clinking as Pembroke counted, his lips moving silently. 1,000, he announced finally. Caleb emptied the second pouch. More gold coins joined the first pile. 2,000. A third smaller pouch. 2,200. Caleb reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a handful of silver dollars. "That should cover the rest in your fees." The final count came to $2,350. Hastings stared at the money like it had personally offended him. "Mr. Mercer, I must advise you that this is highly irregular. Taking on someone else's debt without proper legal consultation?" "Don't need legal consultation," Caleb said. "You said if the debt's paid, you leave." "It's paid, so leave." "There are procedures." "Then do them. Write up whatever papers you need. But you're doing it with her debt paid in full, which means this foreclosure is over. Isn't that right?" Hastings' mouth worked silently for a moment. Finally, he said, "Yes, if the debt is paid in full, the foreclosure is suspended. But Mr. Mercer, you should understand that by paying Miss Hartley's debt, you don't automatically gain any claim to the property. The debt would simply be transferred." "I understand how debt works," Caleb interrupted. "Write up your papers confirming payment. Miss Hartley and I will work out the rest ourselves." Eliza finally found her voice. I don't understand what's happening." Caleb turned to her, and for the first time since he'd arrived, his expression softened slightly. "What's happening is these men are leaving, and you're keeping your ranch." "But why? You don't even know me." "No, ma'am," he agreed. "But I know what it's like to watch someone lose everything to men who don't give a damn. And I know I have money I've been saving for land. Seems to me this land's worth saving." It was insane. Impossible. And yet it was happening. Hastings, seeing that this situation had slipped entirely from his control, began gathering the money with Pembroke's help, counting it again to verify the amount. The deputy had straightened up, his hand no longer near his gun, watching the whole scene with obvious confusion. "I'll need a receipt," Caleb said, written and signed, stating that the debt of $2,300 owed by Miss Eliza Hartley to the Territorial Bank has been paid in full on this date, October 15th, 1886. "I'll have to draw up proper documentation back at the bank," Hastings protested. "Then you'll bring it here tomorrow. But I want a signed receipt today, before you leave." Hastings' jaw clenched, but he pulled out a piece of paper and began writing. The scratch of his pen seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet yard. When he finished, he thrust the paper at Caleb with barely concealed anger. Caleb read it carefully before folding it and putting it in his pocket. "Pleasure doing business with you," he said in a tone that suggested it had been anything but. Hastings turned to Eliza. "Miss Hartley, you should be aware that while your immediate debt has been satisfied, you now owe this money to Mr. Mercer. I strongly suggest you consult with a lawyer regarding the terms of repayment." "She'll handle her business how she sees fit," Caleb said before Eliza could respond. "Now, I believe you gentlemen were leaving?" It wasn't a question. Hastings looked like he wanted to argue, but the sight of Caleb Mercer standing there, calm and immovable as stone, seemed to change his mind. He gestured curtly to Pembroke and the deputy. "Pack up the ledgers. We're done here." The three men climbed back into their carriages with considerably less confidence than they'd arrived with. Hastings leaned out the window as the driver prepared to leave. "I'll be back tomorrow with the proper documentation," he said. "Looking forward to it," Caleb replied. Eliza stood motionless as the carriages rolled back down the road, dust rising in their wake. She watched until they disappeared around the bend, until even the sound of wheels had faded into silence. Then she turned to the man who had just saved everything. Caleb Mercer stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, watching her with those storm-gray eyes. His horse, forgotten during the confrontation, had wandered over to the water trough and was drinking deeply. I don't understand, Eliza said again. Why would you do that? You just paid $2,300 for what? For the chance to make an offer, Caleb said, if you're willing to hear it. An offer. Yes, ma'am. But first might be we should talk about this out of the sun. I've been writing since dawn, and I expect you've had a harder morning than you were planning on. Eliza looked back at the house, her house that was somehow still her house, and felt tears threatening again. But this time they weren't entirely from grief. Yes, she said. Yes, let's go inside. She led him up the porch steps, her legs shaky, her mind reeling. Behind them, Caleb's horse finished drinking and began nibbling at the few sad patches of grass that remained in the yard. The house was as she'd left it, or rather, as Hastings had left it, with drawers half open and papers scattered where he'd been cataloging. She felt a flash of embarrassment at the mess, the poverty of it all suddenly visible through a stranger's eyes. But Caleb didn't seem to notice. He removed his hat as he stepped inside, waiting for her to indicate where he should go. The kitchen, Eliza heard herself say. I can make coffee. That would be appreciated, ma'am. She moved through the familiar motions, pumping water, measuring grounds, stoking the fire in the stove. Her hands were trembling, but at least they had something to do. Behind her, she heard Caleb settle into one of the chairs at the kitchen table, the wood creaking under his weight. You said you'd seen me in town, Eliza said, not turning around. When? Few times over the past year, Caleb said. You came in for supplies, mostly. Once to the feed store, when I was selling a horse to the owner. And once at the church social last 4th of July. Eliza had a vague memory of that day, one of the last times she'd felt anything like normal, before the weight of debt and grief had crushed everything else. But she didn't remember seeing him. I didn't notice you, she admitted. Most people don't. I don't make a habit of standing out. The coffee began to percolate. Eliza got down 2 cups, her father's and her mother's, the ones with the blue flowers painted on them, and set them on the table. You said you have an offer, she said, finally turning to face him. Caleb Mercer looked older in the indoor light, the lines around his eyes more pronounced. But his gaze was steady, honest. I do. But before I make it, I need to ask you something. Do you want to keep this ranch? Of course I do, Eliza said immediately. It's my home. My father built it. He died protecting it. But do you want to run it? Or do you just want to keep it because it's yours? The question caught her off guard. Both. I think. I know how to run this place. My father taught me everything. I can handle the horses, manage the breeding program, and the debt, the drought, the fact that you'll be 4 months behind again, come February. Unless something changes, the blunt truth of it hit like a slap. I'll figure it out. I'll work harder, sell more horses. With what breeding stock? Caleb asked quietly. Forgive me for being direct, ma'am, but I took a look at your barn on my way in. You've got 8 horses, 2 of them pregnant. That's not enough to run a profitable breeding operation, not in this economy. Your father might have had the capital and the connections to make it work. You don't. Not yet. Eliza sat down hard in the chair across from him. So what are you saying? That I should just give up? No, I'm saying you need help, and I'm offering it. The coffee pot whistled. Eliza got up mechanically, poured 2 cups, set one in front of Caleb. The normalcy of the action felt surreal. What kind of help? She asked. Caleb wrapped his hands around the cup, not drinking yet. I've been driving cattle for 12 years, he said. Started when I was 18, working for outfits in Texas and Colorado. Spent every season on the trail, saved every dollar I could. I've been looking for land to buy, somewhere to start my own operation. But good land is hard to come by, and when you find it, there's always someone with more money or better connections who gets there first. So you want to buy my ranch? No. Caleb met her eyes. I want to partner with you. Partner. Legal partners. 50-50 ownership. I put in the capital I've been saving. There's more where that $2,300 came from. You contribute the land, the existing stock, your knowledge of horse breeding. We run this place together. Share the profits, share the risk, share the work. Eliza stared at him. You want to go into business with someone you don't even know? I know you didn't give up when your parents died, I know you've been fighting for 4 months to save this place. I know you stood up to those bankmen, even though you had nothing to fight with." He paused. "And I know you love this ranch enough to break your heart trying to keep it. That tells me what I need to know." "But why? Why not just wait until the next foreclosure, buy someone's land outright?" "Because that's not the kind of man I am," Caleb said simply. "I watched my mother lose her farm after my father died. Watched the bank take everything while the neighbors stood around feeling sorry but not helping. I swore if I ever had the means, I'd never stand by and watch that happen to someone else. Not if I could stop it." Eliza's throat was tight. "I can't pay you back. Not $2,300. It would take years." "I'm not asking you to pay me back. I'm asking you to build something with me. If it works, we both profit. If it fails, we both lose. That's what partnership means." It was insane. Absurd. Going into business with a stranger, giving up half ownership of her father's ranch to a man she'd met 30 minutes ago. And yet, "What about the cattle?" she asked. "You said you've been driving cattle. I don't know anything about cattle operations." "And I don't know horse breeding beyond basic care," Caleb said. "But between us, we'd have both covered. I bring in cattle, you develop the horse operation. This ranch has good water access, even in drought. That arroyo feeds from a deep spring. With proper herd management, we could run a modest cattle operation alongside your horses." The bank said the horses weren't worth much in this market. The bank was trying to buy them cheap. Your stock is worth plenty to the right buyers. Buyers I have connections with from my years on the cattle trails. Ranchers who need good working horses and will pay premium prices for animals with proven bloodlines. Eliza's mind was racing. How would this work legally? How do I know you won't just take over once we're partners? "We'll draw up proper papers. 50-50 ownership, equal say, in all decisions. We ride into town tomorrow, talk to a lawyer, make it official. If you want clauses that protect your interests, we put them in." "This isn't a charity, Miss Hartley. It's a business proposition. I need land and an operation to invest in. You need capital and an extra pair of hands. We both need this to work." "Why horses and cattle? Why not just one or the other?" "Diversification. Your father was smart to develop the horse breeding, but he put too many eggs in one basket. The drought hit, the cattle market suffered, and suddenly nobody was buying luxury horses. But if you have both operations, one can carry you through when the other's struggling. It's basic risk management." He was right, and Eliza knew it. She'd thought the same thing herself over the past months, watching her father's careful plans crumble because everything was tied to one market. "And you'd live here?" she asked. "On the ranch?" "I'd need to. Can't run an operation from town. That would be... people would talk." "Let them talk. We're business partners, not..." He stopped, and for the first time Eliza saw a faint color rise in his cheeks. "It would be proper. I can bunk in the barn, or we can build a separate cabin. Whatever makes sense." Eliza looked down at her coffee, her mind churning. This man had just saved her from losing everything. He was offering her a chance to not just survive, but maybe even thrive. And yet, accepting meant fundamentally changing her relationship to her father's ranch, admitting she couldn't do it alone. "Can I think about it?" she asked quietly. "Of course. Take all the time you need." Caleb paused. "Well, maybe not all the time. The debt's paid for now, but winter's coming. We'd need to make decisions about stock management, feed supplies, repairs to infrastructure. The longer we wait, the harder it gets." "How long have you been planning this?" Eliza asked suddenly. Caleb had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "About 2 months. Since I heard in town that you were behind on payments. I asked around, learned about your situation, thought about approaching you earlier, but..." He shrugged. Seemed presumptuous to offer help before it was needed. "And you just happened to show up today. I knew the foreclosure date. Wasn't hard to figure out when to arrive. That's quite a gamble. What if I'd already lost the ranch before you got here?" "Then I would have bought it at auction and offered you a job as foreman," Caleb said simply. Either way, seemed wrong to let good land and a good horse operation go to waste. Eliza didn't know whether to be impressed by his pragmatism or unsettled by it. "I need to see your capital," she said. "If we're going to be partners, I need to know what you're bringing to this beyond the money you just spent on the debt." "Fair enough. Caleb stood. I've got documentation in my saddlebag. Bank statements, letters of credit, inventory of livestock I own that's currently with a cattle outfit in Colorado. Should give you a clear picture. They went back outside. The sun was past its zenith now, beginning the long slide toward evening. Caleb's horse had found a patch of shade and was dozing on 3 legs. Caleb rummaged in his saddlebag and pulled out a leather portfolio. Inside were neatly organized papers, bank statements from accounts in Denver and Santa Fe, letters from cattle outfit managers attesting to his ownership of breeding bulls, and several hundred head of mixed stock, even a letter of reference from a Colorado rancher Eliza recognized the name of. She read through everything twice. The numbers were staggering. After paying her debt, Caleb Mercer still had nearly $4,000 in accessible capital, plus livestock worth at least that much again. You've been saving for a long time, she said. Since I was 18, every dollar I didn't need for basics went into the bank. Figured eventually I'd have enough to buy land outright. But like I said, good land's hard to come by. And you're willing to risk all of this on a partnership with someone you don't know. I'm willing to risk it on someone who's proven she won't quit, Caleb corrected. That's worth more than experience sometimes. Eliza handed the portfolio back. Her heart was pounding. This was either the smartest decision she'd ever make or the most foolish, and she had no way of knowing which until it was too late. If we do this, she said slowly, there have to be rules, clear boundaries. Agreed. I want final say on anything involving the horses. Breeding decisions, sales, training protocols. That was my father's specialty, and it's mine. And I want final say on cattle operations. But for anything that affects the ranch as a whole, major purchases, land improvements, hiring, we decide together. What if we disagree? Then we talk it through until we find a compromise. And if we can't, we bring in a third party to mediate. The lawyer, maybe, or someone else we both trust. It was reasonable. More than reasonable. And yet Eliza still felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump. One more question, she said. Why aren't you married? Why are you out here alone instead of starting a family ranch with a wife? Caleb's expression shuddered slightly. I was engaged once, 5 years ago. She decided she didn't want to be married to a man who was gone 8 months out of the year chasing cattle. Can't say I blame her. This life isn't for everyone. And you never tried again? Spent the last 5 years focused on saving money and learning the business. Didn't seem fair to ask a woman to wait while I figured out my future. He paused. What about you? You're young, capable. Why isn't there a husband helping you run this place? Because the kind of men who wanted to marry me wanted a wife, not a business partner, Eliza said flatly. They wanted someone to cook and clean and produce children while they ran the ranch. My father taught me to run operations, to read contracts, to breed horses. Most men found that intimidating rather than attractive. Their loss, Caleb said, and sounded like he meant it. They stood in the yard, the afternoon heat pressing down on them, 2 people who were strangers contemplating binding their futures together. I need until tomorrow, Eliza said finally, to think about this properly, to make sure I'm not just, she gestured vaguely, reacting to almost losing everything today. That's wise, Caleb agreed. I'll head into town, get a room at the boarding house. Come back tomorrow morning, and you can give me your answer. If it's yes, we'll ride in together and see the lawyer. If it's no, he shrugged, then the debt's still paid, and you've got breathing room to figure out your next move. And if I say no, you'll just walk away? After spending $2,300? Consider it an investment in doing the right thing, Caleb said. Sometimes that has to be enough. He gathered his horse's reins and swung into the saddle with the ease of long practice. Looking down at her, his expression was serious but not unkind. Miss Hartley, I know this is a lot to take in, and I know you've got no reason to trust me beyond what I've done today. But I want you to know, if we do this, I'm committed. I don't quit on partnerships, and I don't quit on land. Your father built something worth protecting. I'd be honored to help you keep building it. Before Eliza could respond, he touched his hat brim and turned his horse toward the road. She watched him ride away, dust rising behind the bay gelding's hooves. Watched until he was just a dark shape in the distance, then nothing at all. Then she turned and looked at her ranch, still hers, against all odds. The barn needed new shingles, the fences needed mending. The well pump was making a grinding noise that meant something was wearing out. The pastures were brown from drought, and the cattle market was depressed, and winter was coming with all its challenges. But the ranch was still here, still hers. The question was whether it should stay only hers, or whether accepting help, accepting partnership, was the smarter, braver choice. Eliza walked back into the house. Her father's coffee cup still sat on the shelf, gathering dust. She picked it up, turned it over in her hands. "What would you do, Papa?" she asked the empty room. But she knew the answer, really. Her father had been pragmatic above all else. He'd partnered with other ranchers when it made sense, borrowed money when he needed capital, hired good workers and paid them fair wages. He'd never let pride get in the way of doing what was necessary. Eliza set the cup down and went to her father's study. The papers Hastings had scattered were still there. Loan documents, breeding records, correspondence with buyers across 3 territories. She spent the rest of the afternoon organizing them, reading through her father's notes, understanding fully for the first time just how complex the operation had been, and how impossible it would be for one person to manage alone. As the sun set, painting the New Mexico sky in shades of orange and crimson, Eliza stood on the porch and watched the land her father had loved disappear into twilight. Tomorrow, Caleb Mercer would return. And tomorrow, she would give him her answer. Eliza woke before dawn, her decision already made, though she couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it had crystallized in her mind. Perhaps it had been while reading through her father's meticulous breeding records, seeing years of careful planning that couldn't be abandoned. Or perhaps it had been the simple, undeniable fact that Caleb Mercer had ridden into her life at precisely the moment she needed saving, and turning away from that seemed not just foolish but ungrateful to whatever force had sent him. She dressed in her most practical work clothes, a split riding skirt and one of her father's old shirts, rolled at the sleeves, and went out to tend the horses before the heat of the day set in. The morning air was cool, almost cold, a reminder that winter would arrive whether she was ready or not. Ranger, the stallion, nickered as she approached his stall. She ran her hand along his neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the glossy coat her father had been so proud of. "We're going to be okay," she told him softly. "I think we're actually going to be okay." The horse huffed and nudged her shoulder, more interested in breakfast than reassurance. By the time she'd finished feeding and watering all 8 horses, the sun was cresting the horizon, flooding the yard with golden light. She was carrying water buckets back to the pump when she heard hoofbeats on the road. Caleb Mercer rode in with the sunrise at his back, looking like something out of a dime novel. His bay gelding moved with the ground-eating stride of a horse accustomed to long distances, and Caleb himself sat the saddle with the unconscious grace of someone who'd spent more of his life on horseback than on foot. He reined in near the porch, his eyes finding hers immediately. "Morning, Miss Hartley." "Morning." Eliza set down the buckets and wiped her hands on her skirt. "You're early. Didn't want to waste daylight if you'd made up your mind." He paused, and she could see tension in the set of his shoulders despite his casual tone. "Have you?" "I have." Eliza took a breath. "My answer is yes. I'll accept your partnership offer." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Relief, maybe, though he masked it quickly. He swung down from his horse and stood facing her across the dusty yard. "You're certain?" he asked. "No second thoughts?" "Plenty of second thoughts," Eliza admitted. "But the first thought keeps winning. I can't do this alone, and you're offering a fair solution. More than fair, considering you've already paid off the debt with no guarantee I'd accept." "Then we should head into town," Caleb said. "Get the legal work started before anything else can go wrong." "Should I saddle a horse?" "Might be easier if we took a wagon. We'll need to transport documents, and there'll be papers to bring back, unless your wagon was already—" "No," Eliza interrupted. "Hastings was lying about that. The wagon's mine. I just didn't want to argue with him about every damn thing." A slight smile tugged at Caleb's mouth. "Smart. Pick your battles." They hitched up Eliza's wagon, a sturdy farm rig her father had built himself, and headed toward town. The ride was quiet at first, both of them apparently uncertain how to navigate this new dynamic. They weren't quite strangers anymore, but they weren't partners yet either. They existed in some liminal space between, and the silence felt heavier because of it. Finally, Caleb said, "Tell me about the horses, your breeding program." What was your father's vision? Eliza glanced at him, grateful for the neutral topic. He wanted to develop a line of horses that combined the endurance of Mustang stock with the size and strength of thoroughbreds. Working horses that could go all day in harsh conditions but still had the speed and temperament for ranch work. He'd been at it for 15 years, carefully selecting bloodlines. Ranger's your foundation stallion. Yes. Papa bought him from a breeder in Kentucky. Cost him nearly everything he had saved at the time. But he said the moment he saw that horse, he knew. Said Ranger had the confirmation he'd been dreaming of. And the mares? 3 are daughters of our previous stallion. Papa kept the best females from each generation. 2 are Mustang crosses with good bone structure. And the 2 pregnant ones are first-generation Ranger foals. If they throw true, those babies will be the proof of concept Papa was working toward. Caleb was quiet for a moment, processing. When are they due? Late December, early January, right in the worst of winter, naturally. Always the way, isn't it? He shook his head. We'll need to make sure the barn's sealed tight. Last thing we need is foals getting pneumonia. The casual way he said "we" sent a small thrill through Eliza. It was real. This was actually happening. What about your cattle? She asked. You said you have stock in Colorado? 300 head, mixed breeds. Mostly Herefords, some Longhorns for hardiness. They're currently with an outfit I worked for last season. The foreman's holding them for me. I paid winter grazing fees before I left. Come spring, I can either sell them and use the capital here, or we can drive them down to New Mexico if we've got the range for it. The Arroyo pasture could probably support 100 head, Eliza said, thinking. Maybe more if we rotate grazing properly, but 300? Not all at once. We'd sell off what we don't need, keep a breeding nucleus, build up slowly. The key is not to overgraze. That's how you kill land permanently. They fell back into silence, but it was more comfortable now. The conversation had established them as equals, both contributing expertise, both invested in making this work. The town of Socorro materialized out of the dusty plain like a mirage, a collection of adobe and wooden buildings clustered around a central plaza, church steeple rising above it all. Even this early, the streets were busy with merchants setting up shop, ranchers bringing in goods, children running errands before school. Eliza felt eyes following them as they drove through town. She knew what people saw, a young woman and a strange man riding together, clearly familiar with each other. The gossip would be all over town by noon. Let them talk. Caleb seemed oblivious to the stairs, his attention focused on finding the lawyer's office. They located it on a side street near the courthouse, a small building with a sign reading Arthur Pemberton, attorney at law. Not related to the bank's assessor, I hope, Eliza muttered. Different spelling, Caleb said, pointing. And even if he was, money talks louder than family in matters of law. They tied up the wagon and went inside. The office was cramped but tidy, shelves lined with legal volumes, desk buried under papers. A man in his 50s looked up from his work, spectacles perched on his nose. Help you folks? We need partnership papers drawn up, Caleb said. Legal and binding, for a ranch operation. Pemberton's eyebrows rose slightly. I see. And you are? Caleb Mercer. This is Miss Eliza Hartley. She owns the Hartley Ranch northeast of here. Ah, yes, I know of it. Your father was Thomas Hartley, wasn't he? The lawyer asked Eliza. He was. Good man. I was sorry to hear of his passing. Pemberton gestured to the chairs across from his desk. Please, sit. Now, you're looking to establish a business partnership for ranch operations. What sort of arrangement did you have in mind? For the next hour, they hammered out the details. 50-50 ownership, equal decision-making authority in their respective areas of expertise, provisions for profit sharing, dispute resolution, dissolution of partnership if necessary. Pemberton asked pointed questions, making sure both parties understood what they were agreeing to. Miss Hartley, he said at one point, you understand that by entering into this partnership, you're essentially giving Mr. Mercer half ownership of property that has been in your family for 3 decades. I do. And you're comfortable with this arrangement. Eliza met the lawyer's eyes steadily. Mr. Mercer paid off my debt yesterday when the bank was foreclosing. Without him, I'd have nothing. With him, I have a chance to keep my family's ranch running and profitable. Yes, I'm comfortable. Pemberton turned to Caleb. And you, sir, are putting significant capital into a property you've never worked, with a partner you barely know. That strikes you as sound business? It does, Caleb said simply. I've researched the property values, reviewed the breeding records Miss Hartley showed me, and assessed the land quality myself. The fundamentals are solid. What was lacking was working capital and labor, both of which I can provide. The lawyer studied them both for a long moment, then shrugged. Well, it's your futures. I'll draw up the papers. It'll take me a few days to get everything properly documented and witnessed. In the meantime, I'd suggest you both think very carefully about what you're doing. Partnerships can be wonderful or disastrous, and the difference usually comes down to how well the partners communicate. We'll manage, Eliza said with more confidence than she felt. They left the lawyer's office with a handshake agreement to return in 3 days to sign the formal documents. As they walked back to the wagon, Caleb said, "We should stop at the general store. If we're going to start working the ranch properly, we'll need supplies." "I don't have much cash," Eliza admitted. "I do. Consider it an advance on partnership expenses." At the general store, they drew more stairs. Mrs. Henderson, the proprietor's wife, looked like she wanted to ask questions but settled for excessive politeness instead. "Miss Hartley, how lovely to see you. And Mr. Mercer," Caleb supplied. "Ma'am." They purchased fencing supplies, nails, lamp oil, coffee, flour, salt pork, beans, the basics of ranch life. Caleb added a new axe and a coil of good rope. Eliza threw in fabric for winter curtains, feeling oddly domestic about it. As they loaded the supplies into the wagon, a familiar voice called out, "Eliza Hartley, is that you?" Eliza turned to see Margaret Sullivan approaching, a woman her own age she'd known since childhood. Margaret's eyes were alight with curiosity. "Maggie," Eliza said, forcing a smile. "Good to see you." "And you. I heard the most extraordinary rumor yesterday, something about the bank trying to foreclose on your ranch." "They did try," Eliza said evenly. "The debt's been paid." "Oh, thank heavens! But how on earth did you—" Margaret's eyes slid to Caleb, standing beside the wagon. "Oh, I see." Eliza could practically see the assumptions forming. "Maggie, this is Caleb Mercer. He's going to be my business partner. We're running the ranch together." Business partner. Margaret's tone suggested she thought the term meant something else entirely. "How progressive of you." "It's a legitimate partnership," Eliza said, her voice cooling. "We're drawing up legal papers." Of course. I'm sure it's all very proper." Margaret smiled in a way that indicated she was sure of no such thing. "Well, I must be going. Mother's waiting at the dressmaker's. But we should have tea soon, Eliza. I'm simply dying to hear all about your new arrangement." She swept off in a rustle of skirts, already looking around for someone else to tell. "Well," Caleb said dryly, "that went about as expected." "It's going to be like this for a while," Eliza said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "People will talk. They'll assume. Let them assume. We know the truth, and that's what matters." Caleb climbed up onto the wagon seat. "Besides, once they see how hard we're working and how professional our operation is, they'll find something else to gossip about." Eliza hoped he was right, but she had her doubts. Small towns had long memories and loved their scandals. They headed back to the ranch, the wagon creaking under the weight of supplies. Halfway there, Caleb spoke up. "I've been thinking about the living arrangements." Eliza's stomach tightened. "Yes?" "The barn's fine for now, but it won't be comfortable come winter. And if we're going to make this partnership work long term, I'll need proper quarters. I'm thinking we could add a room onto the house. Separate entrance, its own stove for heat. Would cost some, but it'd be a good investment." "That seems sensible," Eliza said, relieved he was approaching it practically. "Or," Caleb continued, "if you'd rather maintain more separation, I could build a small cabin near the barn. Take longer, but it'd give us both more privacy." "The addition makes more sense," Eliza decided. "The house is solid, and we'd save on materials. Plus, with 2 people working the ranch, it'd be good to have someone close by in case of emergencies." "Fair point. I'll start on it next week once we've got the partnership papers signed." They lapsed back into silence, but Eliza's mind was churning. She was about to share her home, not just her ranch, but her actual living space, with a man she barely knew. It was practical, necessary, and completely scandalous by conventional standards. Her mother would have had fits. Her father might have understood. When they reached the ranch, they spent the afternoon unloading supplies and taking stock of what repairs needed to be tackled first. Caleb's practiced eye caught things Eliza had either missed or hadn't known how to fix. "That fence line's about to collapse," he said, pointing to the eastern pasture. "Posts are rotted through. We'll need to replace at least 20 of them." "I know," Eliza said. "I just didn't have the time or the materials." "We've got both now. I'll start on it tomorrow." They worked side by side through the afternoon, Caleb inspecting buildings and equipment while Eliza tended the horses. She found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, the efficient way he moved, the careful attention he paid to details, the respect he showed for her father's work even when pointing out flaws. As the sun began to set, Eliza realized she hadn't eaten since breakfast. "I should make dinner," she said. You're welcome to join me, since we're partners now." Caleb looked up from the gate hinge he'd been examining. "That'd be appreciated, ma'am, but I can cook for myself if you'd rather." "Don't be ridiculous. There's no sense in both of us cooking separately." She paused. "Though I should warn you, I'm a better horse trainer than I am a cook." "I've eaten trail food for 12 years, Caleb said with a slight smile. "I guarantee you're better than that." Dinner was simple. Salt pork fried with potatoes, beans, coffee strong enough to strip paint. They ate at the kitchen table, the same table where her family had shared thousands of meals, and Eliza tried not to think about how strange it was to have someone new sitting in her father's chair. "This is good," Caleb said, and sounded like he meant it. "You're being kind." "I'm being honest. You should taste my cooking. You'd understand the difference." They fell into an easy conversation about the next day's work plans, what needed to be prioritized, how to allocate labor most efficiently. It was all very professional and practical, which somehow made it easier than if they'd tried to talk about personal things. After dinner, Caleb insisted on helping with the dishes despite Eliza's protests. "If we're partners, we share the work," he said. "All of it." "Even the women's work?" Eliza asked, a bit archly. "Especially that. I've been doing my own cooking and cleaning for over a decade. Don't see why it should suddenly become someone else's job just because there's a woman around." Eliza found herself liking him more in that moment than she had since he'd arrived. As darkness fell, Caleb collected his bedroll from his horse and headed toward the barn. "There's spare blankets in the house," Eliza called after him. "If you need them." "I'll be fine. Sleep well, Miss Hartley." "Eliza," she said impulsively, "if we're going to be partners, you should call me Eliza." He turned back, silhouetted against the dying light. "Then you should call me Caleb. Partners don't stand on formality." "Good night, Caleb." "Good night, Eliza." She watched him disappear into the barn, then went inside and locked the door, a new habit since yesterday's near foreclosure. The house felt emptier than usual, but also somehow more alive. For the first time in months, there was possibility in the air instead of just dread. The next 3 days established a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. They worked from sunup to sundown, Caleb tackling the fence repairs while Eliza managed the horses and handled the endless small tasks that kept a ranch functioning. They ate meals together, discussed plans and problems, and gradually learned each other's work styles and temperaments. Caleb, Eliza discovered, was methodical and patient, the kind of man who did things right the first time, even if it took longer. He didn't talk much while working, but when he did speak, his words were considered and useful. He had a wry sense of humor that caught her off guard sometimes, dry observations that made her laugh when she least expected it. For his part, Caleb seemed to appreciate that Eliza knew her business and didn't need constant supervision or instruction. She caught him watching her work with the horses once, a look of something like respect on his face when she settled a skittish mare with nothing but patience and a soft voice. On the third day, they rode back to town to sign the partnership papers. Attorney Pemberton had everything prepared, 2 copies of a comprehensive partnership agreement that laid out every detail of their arrangement. Eliza read through it twice, her heart pounding as the reality sank in. This was it. This was the moment she officially stopped being the sole owner of her father's ranch and became half of something new. "Any questions before you sign?" Pemberton asked. Eliza looked at Caleb. He met her eyes steadily, his expression calm. "No questions," she said. They signed. Pemberton witnessed. The partnership was official. Walking out of that office felt like stepping into a different life. The same sun shone on the same dusty street, but everything had changed. "How do you feel?" Caleb asked as they climbed onto the wagon. "Terrified," Eliza admitted. "Relieved. Hopeful. All of it at once." "That's about right," Caleb agreed. "I'd be worried if you weren't at least a little scared. Means you understand what we're taking on." As they drove out of town, Eliza saw Vernon Hastings standing outside the bank, watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. She lifted her chin and met his gaze squarely. He'd tried to take everything from her, now she was driving away with a partner and a future. Let him choke on that. Back at the ranch, they celebrated with a slightly better dinner than usual. Eliza had splurged on a chicken from town, and she roasted it with wild herbs she'd gathered from the hills. It was almost festive, though neither of them acknowledged it as such. After dinner, Caleb spread out a rough sketch on the table. "I've been thinking about the room addition," he said. "If we extend off the east side of the house, we can use the existing wall for support and tie into the current roof line. Won't be fancy, but it'll be solid and warm." Eliza studied the drawing. "When would you start?" "Tomorrow, if the weather holds. I can work on it in the evenings after the fence repairs are done." "That's a lot of work." "Work's what I'm here for." Over the next 2 weeks, the ranch transformed. The fence line got new posts straight and strong, the barn roof was patched, the well pump was repaired, and slowly, board by board, Caleb built himself a room onto the side of the house. Eliza helped when she could, holding boards steady while he nailed, fetching tools, mixing mortar for the small stove he installed. She learned that he worked with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else, never rushing but never wasting motion either. They fell into patterns of domestic life that felt both intimate and carefully boundaried. Caleb rose first each morning, got the coffee going, and tended to his horse before Eliza came down. She handled breakfast while he planned the day's work. They'd discuss priorities over coffee, then split up to tackle separate tasks, coming back together at midday for a quick meal and an update on progress. The scandalmongers in town gradually lost interest when nothing scandalous actually happened. A few people even started treating the partnership as legitimate. Ranchers who stopped by to look at horses, merchants who dealt with Caleb as a proper business partner rather than some interloper. One afternoon in early November, a grizzled cattleman named Jack Morrison rode up to look at horses. He'd known Eliza's father and had always been straight in his dealings. "Heard you'd taken on a partner," Morrison said to Eliza. "People in town had thoughts about that." "I'm sure they did," Eliza said evenly. Morrison studied Caleb, who was reinforcing a corral fence nearby. "That him?" "That's Caleb Mercer. Would you like to meet him?" "Already have, about 6 years back. He was working a cattle drive through Colorado. Good man, from what I recall. Honest dealer." Morrison nodded approvingly. "You could have done worse." It was the closest thing to a blessing Eliza had received from anyone in town, and it meant more than she'd expected. As November progressed and the days grew shorter, the ranch began to feel less like a burden Eliza was struggling to carry, and more like a genuine operation. The pregnant mares were showing now, their bellies round with the promise of new life. Caleb had the room addition nearly finished, and the two of them had developed a working relationship built on mutual respect and surprisingly easy companionship. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the hills, Caleb said, "I need to go to Colorado." Eliza's stomach dropped. "When?" "Soon, before the real winter weather sets in. I need to settle things with the cattle outfit, make decisions about the herd, and bring back some bulls if we're going to start our own breeding program here." "How long will you be gone?" 3 weeks, maybe a month. Depends on the weather and how much of the herd I decide to drive back." A month. The thought of managing the ranch alone again, even temporarily, filled Eliza with something close to panic. She'd gotten used to having help, to being part of a partnership. The idea of going back to solitary struggle, even briefly, was unexpectedly daunting. "The mares," she said. "They're due in December. If something goes wrong, I'll be back well before then," Caleb assured her. "I'm thinking to leave in a couple days, be back by mid-December at the latest. That gives us a cushion before the foals arrive. What if you get delayed? What if there's a blizzard or... Eliza. Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. I'm not abandoning the partnership. I'm going to handle necessary business so we can move forward. You managed this ranch alone for months before I showed up. You can handle a few weeks now. That was different. I didn't have a choice then. And you don't now. This trip is necessary. He paused. Unless you don't trust me to come back. Eliza looked at him sharply. That's not... I trust you. I just... She struggled to articulate the fear. I'm not used to depending on someone, and now that I have, the thought of being alone again feels harder than it did before. That's partnership, Caleb said quietly. It makes you stronger together, but it also means you feel the absence more when you're apart. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Just means it matters. He was right, and Eliza knew it. She nodded reluctantly. I'll need you to handle the fence work while I'm gone, Caleb continued, shifting to practical matters. And there's a section of roof on the barn that needs patching before the snow comes. I'll leave detailed notes about everything. Detailed notes. You think I can't remember instructions? I think you'll have enough on your mind without trying to remember whether I said the northwest or northeast corner needed bracing. They spent the next 2 days in a flurry of preparation. Caleb finished the room addition, a simple but well-built space with a narrow bed, a stove, a chair, and pegs for hanging clothes. He moved his few possessions in, and suddenly the house felt different, more occupied, more like a home shared rather than a space borrowed. He wrote out pages of instructions for ranch maintenance, organized the tools so everything was easy to find, and made Eliza practice repairs she might need to handle in his absence. She tolerated the fussing because she understood it came from concern, not condescension. The evening before his departure, they had a quiet dinner. Eliza had made stew thick with vegetables and meat, the kind of meal that would sustain a man through a long journey. I'll send word when I reach Colorado, Caleb said. And again before I start back. If you need anything, if there's an emergency, you can wire the cattle outfit. They'll get word to me. I'll be fine, Eliza said with more confidence than she felt. I know you will, but it's okay to ask for help if you need it. That's what partnership means, knowing you don't have to do everything alone. After dinner, Caleb went to tend his horse one last time, making sure the gelding was ready for the long journey ahead. Eliza stood on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, against the November cold, and watched him work. He moved through the barn with the easy familiarity of someone who'd already made the place his own. 2 months ago, he'd been a stranger. Now he was her partner, and she was trusting him with half of everything she owned. More than that, she was trusting him to come back. When he returned to the house, his saddlebags packed and ready for morning, Eliza was still on the porch. You should get some sleep, he said. I'll be leaving before dawn. I wanted to say... Eliza paused, searching for words. Thank you. For everything. For the debt. For the partnership. For building a room instead of just living in the barn. For treating this like it matters. It does matter, Caleb said simply. This ranch, this partnership, it's the foundation of everything I've been working toward. Of course it matters. Still, thank you. He nodded, touched his hat brim in that gesture she'd come to recognize as his version of goodbye, and headed to his new room. Eliza went inside to her own bed, but sleep was a long time coming. She lay awake listening to the small sounds of the house settling, the wind moving through the eaves, and somewhere beyond her wall, the quiet movements of someone else in the space that had been hers alone for so long. Tomorrow, Caleb would leave, and she would be alone again, managing the ranch, waiting for his return, hoping her trust in him wasn't misplaced. But for tonight, in this moment, she wasn't alone, and that, she was learning, made all the difference. The sound of hoofbeats fading into the pre-dawn darkness was the loneliest sound Eliza had ever heard. She stood on the porch, coffee cup cooling in her hands, and watched until even the dust from Caleb's departure had settled back to earth. Then she was alone with 3 weeks of work and 2 pregnant mares, and the creeping doubt that maybe she'd trusted too quickly, believed too easily in a stranger who'd promised partnership but might simply disappear into Colorado and never return. She shook off the thought. Caleb had signed legal papers. He'd built a room onto her house. He'd invested his own money alongside hers. Men didn't do those things if they planned to vanish. Still, the ranch felt emptier than it had before he'd arrived, as if his presence had filled more space than she'd realized. Eliza threw herself into work. The fence line Caleb had started needed finishing. The barn roof he'd mentioned required patching before the winter storms arrived. The horses needed their usual care, plus extra attention for the pregnant mares who were growing heavier and more uncomfortable by the day. There was firewood to split, water to haul, 1,000 small repairs that had been waiting for time and energy she hadn't possessed. By the end of the first day alone, Eliza's hands were blistered and her back ached. She made a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, ate standing at the stove because sitting down at that empty table felt too depressing, and fell into bed so exhausted she didn't have energy to worry. The second day brought a cold wind from the north, the kind that promised snow even though the sky remained stubbornly clear. Eliza worked on the barn roof, hammer and nails clutched in half-frozen fingers, trying to remember everything Caleb had shown her about proper shingle placement. She was halfway through when one of the pregnant mares began showing signs of distress. Eliza scrambled down the ladder so fast she nearly fell, her heart pounding. The mare, a bay named Sage, was pawing at the ground, turning in circles, her flanks dark with sweat despite the cold. "Easy, girl," Eliza murmured, approaching slowly. "Easy now." But Sage's eyes were rolling white, and her breathing came in harsh gasps. This wasn't right. The foal wasn't due for another 6 weeks at least. If she was going into early labor, Eliza's medical knowledge of horse births was solid but not exhaustive. Her father had handled most of the difficult deliveries with Eliza assisting. She'd seen complications before, knew the signs of trouble, but she'd never managed a premature birth entirely on her own. She got Sage into a clean stall, bedded thick with fresh straw, and examined her carefully. The mare's water hadn't broken, but the contractions were visible, her whole body tensing with each wave. Too early. This was happening too early. "Come on, Sage," Eliza whispered, running her hand along the mare's sweat-soaked neck. "Hold on. Just hold on." For 3 hours, Eliza stayed with the horse, monitoring every contraction, every shift in breathing, ready to intervene if the birth began in earnest. She'd sent up every prayer she knew and invented a few more. Finally, miraculously, the contractions began to space out, growing weaker instead of stronger. Sage's breathing eased. The crisis, whatever had triggered it, was passing. By the time Eliza stumbled back to the house, it was well past midnight. She collapsed into bed still wearing her work clothes, too exhausted to care about propriety or comfort. The next morning, Sage seemed better, though Eliza watched her carefully throughout the day. No more contractions, no signs of distress. Whatever had happened, the mare had weathered it. But the incident had shaken Eliza badly. What if the contractions had continued? What if the foal had come early and needed specialized care? What if there had been a breech birth, or hemorrhaging, or any of the dozen things that could go wrong? She would have been alone, making life or death decisions with no one to consult, no second pair of hands to help. That night she sat at the kitchen table with Caleb's detailed notes spread in front of her, and for the first time since he'd left, she let herself cry. Not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming weight of responsibility, the bone-deep exhaustion of doing everything alone, the fear of failing when failure could mean losing an animal or worse. She cried for her father, who'd made this work look easy, for her mother, who'd never complained about the isolation and hardship, for herself, trying to be strong enough to carry a legacy that felt too heavy for one person's shoulders. The tears didn't solve anything, but they helped. She washed her face, made coffee, and went back to work. A week into Caleb's absence, a telegram arrived from Colorado. The writer from town delivered it personally, clearly hoping for gossip, but disappointed when Eliza read it without comment and sent him away. The message was brief. Arrived safe. Herd healthy. Weather holding. Will write. CM. Eliza read it 3 times, relieved by the confirmation that he'd made it to Colorado, frustrated by how little information those terse lines contained. Will write. When? With what details? The promised letter arrived 5 days later, longer than the telegram, but still characteristically concise. Caleb had found the herd in good condition. He was negotiating with the outfit's foreman about which cattle to sell and which to bring back. The weather had turned cold but remained clear. He expected to start the return journey within the week. "How are the mares?" he'd written. "Any signs of early labor? Make sure Sage stays calm and well fed. Watch for swelling in the legs. That can indicate problems. And don't try to finish the barn roof by yourself if the weather turns. It can wait until I return. You're more valuable than shingles." The last line made Eliza's throat tight. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her father's desk, then went out to check on Sage, who was indeed showing some swelling in her rear legs. Eliza spent the rest of that day researching remedies in her father's old veterinary books, mixing poultices, wrapping the mare's legs in careful bandages. The swelling went down by morning. The days blurred together. Work, worry, small victories, and smaller setbacks. The weather grew colder. The first snow fell. Light dustings that melted by afternoon but promised heavier storms to come. Eliza finished the fence line repairs, patched what she could of the barn roof, and prepared the ranch as best she could for winter's arrival. She also discovered just how much Caleb had been doing that she hadn't fully registered. The firewood didn't split itself. The water didn't haul itself from the well. The tools didn't clean and organize themselves. Small maintenance tasks that had somehow gotten done when two people shared the work now piled up, demanding attention she didn't have time to give. By the third week, Eliza was running on determination and coffee. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, and the dark circles under her eyes had become permanent fixtures. But the ranch was still standing, the horses were healthy, and she'd proven to herself that she could, in fact, manage alone if she had to. She just really, really didn't want to. On the 22nd day of Caleb's absence, Eliza was in the barn treating a minor cut on one of the geldings when she heard hoofbeats and the unmistakable sound of cattle lowing. Her heart leaped. She dropped the medicine tin and ran outside. 3 riders were coming up the road, driving a small herd of cattle before them, maybe 30 head, moving at the slow, steady pace of animals who'd traveled far. And leading the whole operation, sitting tall in his saddle despite obvious exhaustion, was Caleb Mercer. Eliza's relief was so intense it made her dizzy. She gripped the barn door frame to steady herself, watching as the riders expertly guided the cattle into the arroyo pasture. Caleb swung down from his horse, said something to the other 2 men, then turned toward the house. His eyes found her immediately, and even from a distance she could see his expression shift, concern replacing fatigue. He covered the ground between them in long strides. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine. Eliza realized she was shaking. "I'm fine. You're back." 3 days early. We made better time than expected. Caleb's eyes were scanning her face, taking in the weight loss, the exhaustion, the signs of someone who'd been pushing too hard for too long. "Have you been eating?" "Yes, mostly, when I remember." "Eliza, the mares are fine," she said quickly, knowing that's what he'd ask next. "Sage had some early contractions about 2 weeks ago, but they stopped. I've been watching her closely. There's been some swelling in her legs, but I treated it and it's mostly resolved. Everything's fine." Caleb looked like he wanted to argue with that assessment, but one of the other riders called out to him. "Mercer, we got the cattle settled. You want us to stay and help with anything else?" "No, Tom. You and Davis head on into town. Get yourselves some hot food and a warm bed. I'll settle up with you tomorrow." The 2 riders tipped their hats and rode off, clearly too tired to care about anything except sleep. Caleb turned back to Eliza. "Come on, you need to sit down before you fall down." "I'm not going to fall down." "Humor me anyway." He guided her toward the house with a hand on her elbow, and Eliza was too tired to protest. Inside, he sat her at the kitchen table and immediately began building up the fire in the stove. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" he asked. "I eat proper meals." "That's not an answer." Eliza tried to remember. "Yesterday? I think I had eggs yesterday morning." Caleb muttered something under his breath that sounded uncomplimentary. He rummaged through the pantry, pulling out supplies, and within minutes had bacon sizzling in the pan. The smell made Eliza's stomach growl loudly enough that Caleb glanced at her with an "I told you so" expression. While the food cooked, he poured her coffee, real coffee, strong and hot, and stood watching her with his arms crossed like he was afraid she might disappear if he looked away. "I told you to take care of yourself," he said. I did take care of myself. I just also took care of everything else. You look like you haven't slept in a week. I sleep, Eliza protested, just not consistently. Caleb shook his head and turned back to the stove. He piled a plate high with bacon, eggs, and fried potatoes, set it in front of her, and said, "Eat." Eliza wanted to argue on principle, but the food smelled too good, and she was too hungry. She ate, and Caleb cooked another batch for himself. And for a while the kitchen was silent except for the sounds of eating and the comforting crackle of the fire. Finally, Caleb said, "Tell me what happened with Sage." Eliza recounted the scare with the early contractions, the hours of monitoring, the swelling that had appeared and been treated. Caleb listened without interrupting, his expression growing more concerned with each detail. "You should have wired me," he said when she finished. "And said what? Come back because I'm scared? You were doing important work. I handled it." Partnership means we handle things together, Eliza. That includes the scary parts. You weren't here, so I handled it alone. That's what people do. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "I shouldn't have left you alone for 3 weeks. That was poor judgment on my part. You had to go, we both knew that. I should have made better arrangements, hired someone to help while I was gone, at least. We can't afford to hire help yet. We can afford it better than we can afford you working yourself to death trying to do everything." He pushed his empty plate aside. "From now on, if I need to leave for more than a few days, we make sure you have help. That's not negotiable." Eliza wanted to argue, but exhaustion was catching up with her now that the adrenaline of his return was fading. "Fine. Did you bring back the bulls?" 3 of them. Young, good bloodlines, different enough genetics that we can build a healthy breeding program. They're with the herd in the Arroyo pasture." He paused. "I also brought back some of my personal stock. Had to sell off the rest to the outfit, but I kept the best breeding cows. Figure we can build up from there." "How many head total?" 32 cattle, 3 bulls. Not a huge operation, but it's a start." Eliza did some mental math. With proper management, they could double that herd within 2 years, have a genuinely profitable cattle operation within 5. Combined with the horse breeding program, the ranch could actually thrive instead of just survive. "That's good," she said. "That's really good." Caleb was watching her again with that concerned expression. "When's the last time you had a full night's sleep?" Define full. "More than 4 hours." Eliza thought about lying, but what was the point? "I don't remember." "Right, you're going to bed. Now." "It's barely evening." "And you're dead on your feet. Go. Sleep. I'll handle evening chores." "You just drove cattle from Colorado, and you've been running this ranch alone for 3 weeks. I'm tired. You're exhausted. There's a difference." When Eliza didn't move, he added more gently, "Please, let me take care of things for one night. You've earned it." The kindness in his voice undid her. Eliza nodded, too tired to keep arguing, and headed upstairs. She meant to change into a nightgown, to wash her face, to do all the normal evening rituals. Instead, she sat down on the edge of her bed to unlace her boots and woke up 10 hours later, fully clothed, with a blanket draped over her that hadn't been there when she'd sat down. Morning light was streaming through the window. Eliza sat up, disoriented, and realized Caleb must have come in sometime during the night to cover her. The thought should have felt intrusive, but instead it felt like care. She changed properly, washed, and went downstairs to find breakfast already cooking and Caleb gone, presumably out tending to the animals. On the table was a note in his blocky handwriting. "Stay inside. Rest. We'll handle all chores today. This is not a request." Eliza smiled despite herself. She ignored the note, of course, and went out to help with chores, but she did it at a more measured pace than she'd managed in weeks. And when Caleb shot her an exasperated look across the barn, she just shrugged. "Partners share the work, remember? You said so yourself." "I meant when you're not half dead from exhaustion." "I'm not half dead. I'm just a quarter dead. Completely different. You're impossible. You're the one who decided to partner with me." Something in Caleb's expression softened. "Yeah, I did." They worked through the morning, falling back into the rhythm they'd established before his departure. It was remarkable how quickly it felt natural again. The unspoken coordination, the easy division of tasks, the simple comfort of shared labor. By afternoon, Eliza was feeling more like herself. They walked out to the arroyo pasture to check on the new cattle, and Eliza had to admit Caleb had chosen well. The animals were healthy, well-formed, with the sturdy build needed for this harsh territory. "They'll do," she said, which was high praise, and they both knew it. "The bulls should service the mares as well as the cows if needed," Caleb said. "Though you'll probably want Ranger doing most of that work." "Definitely, but it's good to have options." They stood watching the cattle graze, the winter sun weak but present, the wind cold but not brutal. It was one of those perfect moments of ranch life. Everything peaceful, everything in its proper place. Then Caleb said, "I need to tell you something." Eliza's stomach tightened. Here it came, whatever bad news he'd been waiting to deliver. "What is it?" "While I was in Colorado, I had time to think. About the partnership, about our arrangement, about how things have been working." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "This is working, Eliza. Better than I expected, honestly. You're a good partner, fair, capable, willing to carry your share, and then some. Maybe too willing, based on the last 3 weeks. Is there a but coming? No, no but. I'm just saying that I'm in this for the long term. Whatever happens, however hard it gets, I'm committed to making this partnership work. I wanted you to know that." The relief that flooded through Eliza was more intense than she'd expected. She'd been bracing for him to say he was having second thoughts, that 3 weeks alone had made him reconsider, that maybe this had all been a mistake. Instead, he was doubling down. "I'm committed too," she said, "even when you drive me crazy with your insistence on doing everything properly instead of just getting it done. And even when you work yourself into the ground trying to prove you don't need help. Even then." They turned back toward the house, walking side by side through grass that was already browning for winter. Eliza found herself thinking about how different her life looked now compared to 3 months ago. The foreclosure, the debt, the crushing weight of trying to save her father's ranch alone, it all seemed like a different lifetime. That evening, they had a proper dinner together at the kitchen table. Caleb had clearly missed decent food during his journey because he'd made an actual effort. Steak from the cattle he'd brought back, potatoes roasted with wild onions, even a pie made from dried apples. It was almost celebratory. "This is fancy," Eliza observed. 3 weeks of trail food makes you appreciate cooking." "I thought you said my cooking was good." "It is. But you don't make pie." "Fair point." After dinner, they sat on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in coats, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Caleb had brought out coffee, and the warmth of the cup felt good against Eliza's hands. "The mares," Caleb said. "How close do you think they are?" "Sage could go any time. She's dropped. You can see the shape change in her belly. The other one, Willow, probably has another week or 2. We should set up a watch schedule. Make sure someone's checking on them every few hours through the night. I was planning on sleeping in the barn once Sage gets really close." "We both will then. Take shifts. That way we both get some sleep, but the horses are never unattended." The casual way he said "we" still gave Eliza a small thrill. She'd been alone for so long that having someone else automatically include themselves in her plans felt like a gift she hadn't known she needed. "Caleb," she said impulsively, "thank you. For coming back, for bringing the cattle, for—" She gestured vaguely, unable to articulate all of it. "Everything." He looked at her, his eyes serious in the starlight. "You don't need to thank me for keeping my word, Eliza. That's just basic decency." "Still, a lot of men wouldn't have." "Then you've known the wrong kind of men." Maybe she had, or maybe she'd just never had the chance to know someone like Caleb Mercer, someone who said what he meant and followed through, who treated partnership as sacred rather than convenient, who saw her as an equal rather than a woman who needed managing. That night, Eliza slept deeply and dreamlessly in her own bed, knowing that downstairs in his room, Caleb was doing the same. The house felt complete in a way it hadn't since her parents died. Not because a man was living there, but because it was no longer a space designed for loneliness. The next morning brought the first serious snow, big, fat flakes that fell thick and fast, covering the ranch in white. Caleb and Eliza worked together to make sure all the animals had shelter and extra feed, that the water troughs wouldn't freeze, that the firewood was stacked close to the house. By mid-morning, the snow was falling so heavily they could barely see the barn from the house. This is going to be a bad one, Caleb said, watching from the kitchen window. Good thing you got back when you did. Another day, and you'd have been stuck in it. Another day, and I would have been worried sick about you stuck in it alone. They spent the day inside doing indoor work, mending tack, organizing supplies, going over the books together. Caleb showed Eliza the financial records from the cattle sale, explaining how he'd negotiated prices, what he'd spent on supplies for the journey back. You're better with numbers than I expected, Eliza observed. Trail bosses have to be. You're managing payroll, supply costs, road expenses, sale prices at the end. You get good at math, or you go broke. Eliza showed him her breeding records, the careful documentation her father had started and she'd continued. Caleb asked intelligent questions about bloodlines and genetic inheritance, proving he knew more about selective breeding than he'd initially let on. They worked well together, Eliza realized. Different strengths, different knowledge, but similar values and work ethics. It was a good foundation for partnership. That night, the storm was still raging. They ate dinner by lamplight while snow piled against the windows and wind howled around the eaves. After cleaning up, they sat by the fire. Caleb in the worn armchair that had been her father's, Eliza on the sofa with a blanket across her lap. Tell me about your family, Eliza said. You mentioned your mother's farm. What happened to it? Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, My father died when I was 16, kicked in the head by a horse. Freak accident. My mother tried to keep the farm going, but she didn't know the business side. My father had handled all of that. Within a year, she was behind on debts she didn't even know existed. The bank foreclosed. We lost everything. I'm sorry. She died 2 years later. Just gave up, I think. Couldn't bear living in town after losing the land. I was 18, on my own, with nothing but what I could carry and a burning determination to never be that powerless again. So you started saving. Every dollar, for 12 years. Figured if I ever got another chance at land, I'd make damn sure nobody could take it from me. He looked at her. That's why I couldn't watch it happen to you. Couldn't stand by and let the bank take everything when I had the means to stop it. Eliza understood him better now. The methodical saving, the commitment to the partnership, the fierce protectiveness of what they were building together. He wasn't just investing in land, he was trying to rewrite the ending of his mother's story. We're not going to lose this ranch, she said firmly. Either of us. We're going to build it into something that lasts. I believe that, Caleb said. I really do. The fire crackled. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, in that moment, everything felt secure. 3 days later, the storm finally blew itself out, leaving the ranch buried under 2 feet of snow. They dug out, checked on all the animals, and found everything had survived. The pregnant mares were restless but healthy. Caleb set up the watch schedule he'd mentioned. They took turns checking on Sage every 3 hours through the day and night, looking for signs that labor was beginning. Eliza taught him what to watch for. The pacing, the pawing, the way a mare's belly would tighten with contractions. On the 5th night after his return, Sage went into labor. Eliza was on watch, making her midnight rounds when she found the mare in obvious distress. She ran to wake Caleb, and together they monitored the birth. It was difficult. The foal was positioned wrong, one leg folded back instead of both extended forward. In that position, it couldn't be born safely. I have to reach in and reposition, Eliza said, her voice tight with fear. If I can't, we'll lose them both. Tell me what to do, Caleb said calmly. How can I help? His steadiness centered her. Together, they worked. Eliza reaching carefully into the birth canal to guide the foal's leg forward, while Caleb held Sage's head, murmuring soothing words, keeping the mare from panicking. It took 20 agonizing minutes, Eliza's arm deep inside the laboring horse, feeling with her fingers for the tiny hoof that needed repositioning. Finally, she felt it shift into place. Got it, she gasped. Both legs forward now. She should be able to push. And Sage did, with tremendous effort, until a wet, gangly foal slid into the straw. A filly, perfect and whole, already trying to lift her head. Eliza sat back on her heels, trembling with relief and exhaustion. Caleb was grinning like a fool, still kneeling by Sage's head. We did it, he said. We did, Eliza agreed. They stayed in the barn until the foal was standing, nursing, clearly healthy despite the difficult birth. Sage licked her baby clean with obvious pride, already the protective mother. Walking back to the house in the pre-dawn cold, Eliza realized her hands were still shaking. Caleb noticed and put his arm around her shoulders. Just briefly, just a moment of comfort between partners who'd shared something intense. "You were amazing in there," he said. "I was terrified." Being terrified and doing it anyway, that's what amazing looks like. Inside, Caleb made coffee while Eliza washed up. They sat at the kitchen table, too wound up to sleep despite the hour. "I couldn't have done that alone," Eliza admitted. "If you hadn't been here, if you'd still been in Colorado, I don't know if I could have kept calm enough to reposition the foal." "But I was here," Caleb said. "That's what partnership means. When it's hard, when it's scary, you're not alone." "I spent so long thinking I had to do everything myself," Eliza said quietly, "that asking for help was weakness, that depending on anyone was dangerous. And now? Now I'm starting to understand the difference between dependence and partnership, between weakness and wisdom." She met his eyes. "You've taught me that, whether you meant to or not." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Warmth, maybe, or recognition of the trust she was offering. "You've taught me things too, about commitment to a vision, about not giving up when things get hard, about what it means to love something enough to break your heart trying to save it." They sat in the quiet kitchen as dawn began to break outside. Two people who'd been strangers 4 months ago and were now bound together by contracts and cattle and a perfect newborn filly sleeping in the barn. Eliza knew, with sudden clarity, that this partnership was the best decision she'd ever made. Not just for the ranch, but for herself. Whatever came next, and she suspected plenty would come, both good and challenging, they would face it together. And that made all the difference. The filly they named Starlight because of the white blaze that ran down her face like a streak of moonlight. She thrived in those first weeks, growing stronger each day, and Eliza spent hours watching her discover the world on impossibly long legs. But the joy of new life was shadowed by worry about Willow, the second pregnant mare, who was growing heavier but showing none of the telltale signs that labor was approaching. "She should have dropped by now," Eliza said one morning in mid-December, running her hand along Willow's distended belly. The mare was uncomfortable, shifting her weight constantly, but nothing was progressing the way it should. Caleb frowned, watching the horse carefully. "How overdue is she?" "Nearly 2 weeks. Maybe more." The breeding dates weren't exact. Eliza's voice was tight with concern. "I've never seen a mare go this long. Something's wrong." They increased their monitoring, checking on Willow every 2 hours around the clock. Caleb took the night shifts without complaint, knowing Eliza was already stretched thin with worry. The winter had settled in hard, bringing storms that dumped snow faster than they could clear it, and the daily work of keeping the ranch running in brutal cold left them both exhausted. 3 days before Christmas, Caleb came back to the house at dawn with his face drawn tight. "She's down," he said. "Can't get up." Eliza's heart dropped. She grabbed her coat and ran for the barn, Caleb right behind her. Willow was lying in her stall, sides heaving, eyes rolling in distress. When Eliza tried to encourage her to stand, the mare barely responded. "How long has she been down?" Eliza asked, already examining the horse. "Found her like this 20 minutes ago. She was standing at the midnight check." Eliza's hands moved over Willow's belly, feeling for the foal's position, checking for any sign of labor beginning. What she felt made her blood run cold. The foal was positioned all wrong. Not just a leg out of place, but completely sideways, impossible to birth naturally. "We need a veterinarian," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Now." "The nearest vet is in Socorro. That's 3 hours in good weather, and we've got 2 feet of fresh snow on the ground." "Then go. Ride hard. I'll stay with her." Caleb didn't waste time arguing. He saddled his horse and disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, while Eliza stayed with Willow, trying everything she knew to make the mare more comfortable, to buy time until help could arrive. But time was the one thing they didn't have. 2 hours passed. Willow's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her breathing became labored, her body temperature dropped, and despite everything Eliza tried, the mare was fading. Eliza had delivered difficult foals before, had assisted her father with emergencies, but this was beyond her skill. The foal was too large, positioned too badly, and Willow was too weak to survive the kind of invasive intervention that might save the baby. Eliza sat in the straw beside the dying mare, tears streaming down her face, and made the hardest decision of her life. She couldn't save both. The foal was already likely dead, trapped in a position that had probably cut off its oxygen supply hours ago. But Willow, if Eliza acted now, if she stopped trying to save the foal and focused only on keeping the mare alive, there was a chance. With shaking hands, she did what needed to be done. The procedure was brutal and heartbreaking, and by the time it was over, Eliza was covered in blood and sobbing. But Willow was breathing easier, the impossible weight finally gone from her body. The foal, a colt perfectly formed, had been dead for hours. Caleb arrived with the veterinarian to find Eliza sitting against the stall wall, the dead foal wrapped in canvas beside her, Willow standing on shaky legs but alive. Dr. Harrison took one look at the scene and understood immediately what had happened. He examined Willow thoroughly, gave her medicine to prevent infection, and finally turned to Eliza. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "The foal was already gone. You saved the mare's life." "I know," Eliza whispered. "Doesn't make it easier." After the vet left, Caleb buried the colt in the frozen ground while Eliza stayed with Willow. It took him 3 hours of brutal work, the ground resistant to the shovel, but he did it because it needed doing and because Eliza needed to know the foal had been laid to rest properly. When he came back to the barn, Eliza was still there, sitting in the straw, staring at nothing. "Come inside," Caleb said gently. "You're frozen through." "I should have known sooner. Should have called the vet days ago." "You did everything you could. Sometimes everything isn't enough." "My father never lost a foal, not in 30 years of breeding. Your father had 30 years of experience. You've got 3, and you made a choice that saved Willow's life. That matters." Eliza let him pull her to her feet, let him guide her back to the house. She was numb, moving through the motions of washing and changing into clean clothes without really registering what she was doing. When she came downstairs, Caleb had soup heating on the stove and coffee brewed strong. "Eat," he said, and his tone left no room for argument. She ate because he insisted, tasting nothing, her mind replaying every moment of the past week, wondering what she'd missed, what she could have done differently. "Stop," Caleb said, watching her. "Stop what?" "Blaming yourself. I can see it happening. You're going through every decision, every choice, looking for where you went wrong. Don't." "How can I not? That foal died because sometimes things go wrong. Because nature isn't always kind or fair. Because even when you do everything right, you can still lose." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "You want to know what I see? I see someone who fought for 3 hours in a freezing barn to save what could be saved. Someone who made an impossible choice and had the strength to follow through. That's not failure, Eliza. That's courage." She wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that she'd done her best in an impossible situation, but all she could see was the tiny, perfect colt, dead before he'd ever drawn breath. That night, she cried herself to sleep while winter wind howled around the house. And sometime in the darkest hours, she woke to find Caleb sitting in the chair beside her bed, keeping watch like he'd done the night of Sage's difficult delivery. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Making sure you're all right. I'm fine." "You're not. But you will be." He paused. "My first cattle drive, we lost 100 head to a river crossing. Stampede in the water, animals drowning, nothing we could do to stop it. I thought I'd failed, that I was responsible for every death. The trail boss told me something I've never forgotten. You can do everything right and still lose. Doesn't mean you failed, just means you're working with living things in an unpredictable world." "Did it help? Him telling you that?" "Not right away, but eventually." Caleb stood. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's another day of work." She did sleep finally, and when she woke the next morning, the grief was still there, but no longer crushing. She could breathe around it. Christmas came and went quietly. They worked through the day as usual, though Caleb surprised her with a small gift, a leather journal for keeping breeding records, finer quality than anything she'd been using. "For documenting everything," he said, "successes and failures both. So you can learn from all of it." "I didn't get you anything," Eliza said, embarrassed. You gave me a partnership in land worth building on. That's gift enough. They had a better dinner than usual. Caleb roasted one of the chickens, and Eliza made biscuits that actually turned out well. It was simple, but felt significant, their first holiday together, marking how far they'd come since that desperate day in October when the bank had come to take everything. As winter deepened, they settled into new rhythms. The cattle operation required constant attention, breaking ice on water troughs, hauling feed through snow, checking on animals in brutal cold. The horses needed daily care, and Starlight needed extra attention as she grew. Between them, Caleb and Eliza managed, but there were days when the work felt endless, and the cold seemed determined to break them both. On one particularly vicious morning in January, with temperatures so low that water froze solid within minutes of being poured, Caleb came in from chores with his face white with cold and his hands shaking too hard to hold his coffee cup. "That's it," Eliza said firmly. "We're hiring help, at least one hand to get us through the rest of winter." "We can manage. We can barely manage, and it's killing us both. We need help, Caleb. That's not weakness, that's wisdom." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right. I'll ask around in town, see if anyone's looking for winter work." 2 days later, a young man named Jesse Colton showed up at the ranch. He was 19, rail-thin, with eager eyes and calloused hands that suggested he knew hard work. "Heard you might need help," he said, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands. "I'm good with cattle and horses both. Don't mind cold weather. Work hard, don't complain, and I'm honest." Eliza glanced at Caleb, who was sizing up the young man with the practiced eye of someone who'd hired trail hands for years. "You got references?" Caleb asked. "Worked for the Morrison Ranch last summer. Jack Morrison will vouch for me." That was good enough. Morrison was known for running a tight operation and not tolerating fools. "$1 a day plus board," Caleb said. "You'll bunk in the barn, eat with us at the house. Expected to work whatever hours are needed, which in winter means most of them." "Yes, sir." "And you take direction from either of us equally. This is a partnership operation. Miss Hartley's word carries the same weight as mine." Jesse looked at Eliza with newfound respect. "Yes, sir." "Yes, ma'am." Having Jesse around changed everything. The daily work became manageable again. The three of them could rotate duties, ensuring nothing was neglected and no one worked themselves into exhaustion. Jesse proved to be exactly what he'd claimed: hardworking, reliable, and skilled with livestock. More than that, his presence changed the dynamic between Eliza and Caleb in ways neither had anticipated. With a third person around, even just during working hours, they became more conscious of their growing closeness, the way they'd started finishing each other's sentences, the casual touches that had developed. Caleb's hand on her shoulder when he passed behind her chair, Eliza adjusting his scarf before he went out into the cold. One evening in late January, after Jesse had headed to the barn for the night, Eliza and Caleb sat by the fire as had become their habit. The silence between them was comfortable but charged with something neither had named. "Can I ask you something?" Eliza said finally. "Always. Do you ever think about the future? Not just the ranch, but everything else?" Caleb set down the harness he'd been mending. "I think about it constantly." "And what do you see?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, I see this partnership becoming something more. I see us building not just a successful ranch, but a life together. I see—" He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "What?" Eliza pressed, her heart pounding. "I see myself asking you to marry me," Caleb said quietly. "Not because it's practical or because people expect it, but because somewhere between October and now, I fell in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, brave and vulnerable and completely unexpected. Eliza's breath caught. "Caleb, you don't have to answer now, or at all, if that's not what you want. I'm not trying to change our partnership or make things complicated. I just needed you to know, because I'm not good at hiding what I feel, and I don't want to spend the rest of this winter pretending I don't love you when I do." Eliza stared at him, her mind reeling. She should have seen this coming, should have recognized what was building between them. But she'd been so focused on the ranch, on surviving, on proving she could manage this partnership, that she'd missed the most important development of all. She was in love with him too. The realization hit her like a physical force. Somewhere between his paying off her debt and building a room onto her house and staying up all night with laboring horses and making her eat when she forgot. Somewhere in all of that, she'd fallen completely, irrevocably in love with Caleb Mercer. "I need time," she heard herself say, "to think about this, about what it would mean." "Take all the time you need," Caleb said, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. "Nothing has to change. We're partners first, always." But everything had already changed. The words were out, and Eliza couldn't unhear them, couldn't go back to seeing Caleb as just her business partner when her heart was racing every time he looked at her. She went to bed that night in turmoil, her mind spinning through possibilities and fears. Marriage would mean binding herself to someone permanently, trusting another person with not just her ranch, but her whole life. It would mean vulnerability in ways partnership didn't require. It would mean admitting she needed someone not just for practical reasons, but for emotional ones. The thought terrified her, but it also filled her with a hope she hadn't felt since before her parents died. The hope of building something that lasted, of not facing the future alone, of loving and being loved in return. 3 days later, disaster struck in a way none of them could have anticipated. Caleb was working in the arroyo pasture, checking on the cattle, when his horse spooked at something, a snake maybe, or just a shadow. The gelding reared and Caleb, caught off guard, was thrown hard. He landed wrong, his leg twisted beneath him, and the sickening crack of breaking bone echoed across the empty pasture. Jesse found him 20 minutes later, semi-conscious and gray with pain, his leg bent at an angle that made the young man's stomach turn. "Get Eliza," Caleb managed through gritted teeth. "Don't move me. Just get her." Jesse ran for the house, and Eliza came at a dead run, her medical kit in hand. One look at Caleb's leg told her everything she needed to know. The break was bad, compound fracture, bone visible through torn skin, the kind of injury that could cripple a man permanently if not treated properly. "We need the doctor," she said, forcing herself to stay calm. "Jesse, ride for Socorro, fast as you can. Tell Dr. Harrison it's urgent." "I'll be hours," Jesse protested. "In this cold, with that injury, then we don't have time to argue. Go!" Jesse went, and Eliza was left alone with Caleb, who was fading in and out of consciousness from shock and pain. "Don't you dare die on me," she told him fiercely, working to stabilize the leg as best she could with improvised splints. "You hear me, Caleb Mercer? You don't get to tell me you love me and then die 3 days later. That's not how this works." Through the haze of pain, Caleb managed something that might have been a smile. "Wasn't planning on dying." "Good. Because I have things to say to you, and you're going to be conscious and coherent when I say them." She got him back to the house, a nightmare journey with Jesse's help once the young man returned, and onto his bed. Dr. Harrison arrived 4 hours later, examined the leg, and delivered the news Eliza had been dreading. "The break is severe. I can set it, but there's no guarantee it'll heal properly. Even in the best case, he's looking at months of recovery. Worst case..." The doctor didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Eliza stood in the hallway outside Caleb's room while Dr. Harrison worked, listening to the sounds of agony that Caleb couldn't completely suppress, even with the laudanum the doctor had given him. She'd faced a lot in her 23 years, orphaning, foreclosure, impossible choices, dead foals, but this was different. This was watching someone she loved suffer and being powerless to stop it. When Dr. Harrison finally emerged, he looked grim. "The leg is set. I've done what I can. Now it's up to him, and you. He'll need constant care for the next several weeks. The bone has to heal straight, which means keeping him still even though every instinct will be to move. The wound needs cleaning daily to prevent infection, and he needs to keep his strength up, which won't be easy when he's in that much pain." "I can do all of that," Eliza said. "It won't be easy. You're already running a ranch, and now you're going to be a nurse too." "I don't care if it's easy. Just tell me what to do." The doctor left detailed instructions and enough laudanum to get through the next week. After he rode away into the gathering darkness, Eliza stood in the yard and let herself shake for exactly 1 minute. Then she squared her shoulders and went back inside. Caleb was awake, pale and sweating, his leg immobilized in the splints the doctor had applied. "Eliza," he said weakly, "don't talk. Save your strength. Have to tell you, the cattle. Jesse can't manage them alone, and Willow needs..." "I'll handle it, all of it. Jesse and I will manage the ranch." You focus on healing. Partnership means Partnership means when one of us can't carry the load, the other picks up the slack. Right now, that's me. So you're going to lie there and heal and not worry about anything except getting better. Caleb tried to argue, but exhaustion and pain pulled him under before he could form the words. The next weeks were the hardest of Eliza's life. She and Jesse divided the ranch work between them, taking on Caleb's share as well as their own. The days started before dawn and ended long after dark. In between, Eliza nursed Caleb, cleaning his wound, changing bandages, forcing him to eat when pain killed his appetite, keeping him still when restlessness made him want to move. She slept in snatches, usually in the chair beside his bed, jerking awake at any sound that might indicate he needed help. Jesse stepped up magnificently, working longer hours than he was paid for, never complaining even when the work seemed impossible. Caleb was a terrible patient. He chafed at the enforced stillness, frustrated by his weakness, angry at being dependent when he'd always been the one others depended on. "I should be out there," he said one afternoon, trying to sit up and immediately going white with pain. "You should be healing," Eliza countered, pushing him gently back down. "The ranch is fine. Jesse's doing excellent work. Everything's under control." "You're exhausted. I can see it. I've been exhausted before. I'll survive." "This isn't what I wanted," Caleb said bitterly. "You nursing me like an invalid while the ranch work falls on your shoulders. What you want doesn't matter right now. What you need does." Eliza sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to jar his leg. "Caleb, do you remember what you told me after I lost the foal? That sometimes doing everything right still isn't enough? That doesn't make it failure. It just means you're working with unpredictable things in an unpredictable world? That's different. It's exactly the same. You got thrown from your horse. It wasn't your fault. Wasn't something you could have prevented. Now you're doing everything right, following doctor's orders, resting, healing. That's all you can do." He closed his eyes. "I'm supposed to be your partner, equal. Right now, I'm nothing but a burden. You're not a burden. You're someone I—" She stopped, the words catching in her throat. Caleb's eyes opened, finding hers. "Someone you what?" Eliza took a breath. This wasn't how she'd imagined having this conversation. She'd thought there would be a perfect moment, a romantic setting, time to plan her words carefully. But life didn't offer perfect moments. It offered this, a man she loved lying injured in bed, both of them exhausted, the ranch barely holding together around them. And maybe that was actually perfect in its own way, because this was real life, and real love happened in the middle of difficulty, not in spite of it. "Someone I love," Eliza said quietly. "You asked me 3 days before the accident if I'd ever think about marrying you. I didn't answer because I was scared. Scared of needing someone, scared of depending on anyone, scared of what would happen if I gave you my heart and you broke it." "Eliza Zita, let me finish. I've spent the last few weeks watching you suffer and realizing that I'm already all the way in. I already need you, already depend on you, already love you so much that the thought of losing you makes it hard to breathe. Being scared of getting hurt doesn't change any of that. It just means I'm wasting time we could be spending building a life together." Tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't care. "So yes," she continued, "yes, I'll marry you. If the offer's still open. If you still want me after weeks of me being bossy and terrible at nursing and—" Caleb reached up with his good hand and pulled her down into a kiss that was awkward and perfect and tasted like tears and hope and coming home. "Yes, the offer's still open," he said when they finally broke apart. "And I still want you. I'll always want you. Even though I'm terrible at cooking? Even though we might need to hire someone for that eventually." Eliza laughed through her tears, and Caleb kissed her again, and somewhere in that moment all the fear and exhaustion and worry faded into something simpler and truer. Love, chosen deliberately, built on partnership and respect and the kind of trust that could only come from weathering hard things together. They married quietly in March, with Jesse and Dr. Harrison as witnesses, in the parlor of the ranch house. Caleb was still on crutches, his leg healing but not yet strong enough for walking unaided. Eliza wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit. The ceremony was brief, the celebration modest, but when Caleb slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, Eliza felt like the richest woman in the territory. Partners, Caleb said softly, echoing the words they'd spoken when signing their business agreement months ago. Partners, Eliza agreed, in everything. That night, lying beside her husband in the room that had been hers alone for so long, Eliza thought about how far she'd traveled from that desperate October day. She'd been so certain then that she had to do everything alone, that accepting help was weakness, that depending on anyone would lead to inevitable betrayal. How wrong she'd been. The ranch was theirs now, legally and completely. The cattle operation was growing, the horses were thriving, with Starlight developing into exactly the kind of horse her father had dreamed of breeding. And somewhere in the midst of all that practical success, she'd found something infinitely more valuable, a partner who saw her as an equal, who loved her not despite her strength but because of it, who'd proven again and again that some people could be trusted with your whole heart. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, his voice drowsy. "That I'm happy," Eliza said simply. "For the first time since my parents died, I'm genuinely, completely happy." Caleb pulled her closer, careful of his healing leg. "Good, because this is just the beginning." And lying there in the darkness, listening to her husband's steady breathing, Eliza believed him. The beginning of something that would last. Spring arrived with the kind of explosive beauty that made the hard winter feel like a distant memory. The hills turned green almost overnight, wildflowers carpeting the land in colors so vivid they seemed unreal. The cattle grew fat on new grass, and the horses ran in the pastures with obvious joy at being free of winter's confinement. Caleb's leg healed slowly but steadily. By April, he'd graduated from crutches to a cane, and by May, he'd abandoned even that, though he walked with a slight limp that Dr. Harrison said might be permanent. Eliza caught him sometimes, standing at the fence looking out over the land, his hand unconsciously rubbing the leg that had nearly cost him everything. "Does it hurt?" she asked one evening, coming to stand beside him. "Sometimes. Mostly just reminds me how lucky I am." He turned to her, his expression serious. "I could have lost the leg entirely. Could have died from infection. Instead, I'm standing here with my wife, watching our cattle graze on our land. Hard to complain about a limp when the alternative was so much worse. Their land, their cattle, their life together." The words still gave Eliza a thrill of ownership and pride. Jesse had stayed on through the winter and into spring, proving himself invaluable. He'd grown from a skinny 19-year-old into a capable ranch hand with opinions about cattle management and the confidence to voice them respectfully. Caleb had started teaching him the finer points of breeding selection, and Eliza had him helping with the horses. One afternoon in late May, Jesse approached them both with his hat in his hands and an expression that suggested he had something difficult to say. "What is it?" Caleb asked. "I got an offer," Jesse said. "Jack Morrison wants me to come work for him permanent. Foreman position eventually. Good money, chance to learn the business from the ground up." Eliza's heart sank. They'd come to depend on Jesse, and more than that, she'd grown fond of him. Losing him would mean scrambling to find new help or going back to managing everything with just the two of them. But Caleb surprised her. "That's a good opportunity," he said. "Morrison runs a solid operation. You'd learn a lot." "I'd hate to leave you in the lurch, though," Jesse said, glancing between them. "You've been good to me, taught me plenty. Feels wrong to walk away." "It's not wrong to take a better opportunity," Eliza said, though it cost her to say it. "When would you start?" "Morrison wants me in 2 weeks, but if you need more time to find someone else." 2 weeks is fine," Caleb said firmly. "We'll manage. And Jesse, you've earned this. Don't feel guilty about moving forward." After Jesse left, Eliza turned to her husband. "We can't manage alone, not with the expanded herd and all the horses." "I know, but we also can't hold Jesse back out of our own need. That's not fair to him. So what do we do?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, thinking. "We hire 2 people. Not one hand doing everything, but 2 specialists. Someone who knows cattle inside and out, and someone with real horse expertise. Build a proper crew instead of expecting one person to do it all." It made sense, though it would mean a bigger payroll. But the ranch was profitable now. The horse sales had been strong through the winter, and the cattle operation was showing real promise. They could afford to invest in good help. Over the next week, they put out word through the territory that they were hiring. The responses surprised them. Apparently, the Hartley Mercer Ranch had developed a reputation as a good place to work, fair employers who paid decent wages and treated their hands with respect. They interviewed 5 candidates for the cattle position and settled on a weathered cowboy named Tom Briggs, who'd worked outfits from Texas to Montana and knew breeding stock the way some men knew scripture. For the horse position, they found themselves face to face with an unexpected applicant. Sarah Reeves was 42, whip thin, with calloused hands and eyes that assessed horses with the same intensity Eliza's father had possessed. She'd worked as a stable master for a wealthy family in Kentucky before heading west, and she knew bloodlines and training techniques that Eliza had only read about. "I'll be honest with you," Sarah said, sitting across from them in the ranch house. "Most men won't hire a woman for this kind of work. They assume I can't handle it or that I'll cause problems. But I'm the best horse trainer you'll find in this territory, and I don't care about the pay as long as it's fair and I get to work with quality animals." So Eliza looked at Caleb, saw the question in his eyes, and nodded. "You're hired," Caleb said. "Same wages as Briggs, room in the new bunkhouse we're building, and a stake in any horses you personally train if they sell above a certain threshold." Sarah's eyes widened. "A stake?" "We believe in rewarding good work," Eliza said. "My father always said the best way to get people invested in quality was to give them a personal interest in the outcome. You make our horses better, you profit from it. Seems fair to us." "More than fair," Sarah said, her voice rough with emotion. "When do I start?" They settled into a new rhythm with the expanded crew. Tom took over primary responsibility for the cattle, implementing grazing rotations and breeding strategies that had the herd quality improving within months. Sarah worked magic with the horses, taking Eliza's solid foundation and building on it with techniques that produced animals. Buyers traveled from 3 territories to see. And through it all, Caleb and Eliza learned to balance being business partners with being husband and wife. It wasn't always easy. There were disagreements about money, about priorities, about whose expertise should guide certain decisions. But they'd established patterns early on of talking through conflicts instead of letting them fester, of remembering they were on the same side even when they disagreed about tactics. In July, Eliza realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but hadn't said anything, wanting to be certain before raising hopes or concerns. When Dr. Harrison confirmed it, she sat in the wagon on the drive home trying to figure out how she felt. Excited, certainly. Terrified, absolutely. Her mother had died of a broken heart, but she'd also suffered through 3 miscarriages between Eliza's birth and her father's death. Pregnancy was dangerous, childbirth even more so. Caleb was mending fence when she got back. She walked out to where he was working, her heart pounding. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked up, immediately concerned. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. At least I don't think so. I'm pregnant." Caleb dropped the hammer. For a moment he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he was moving, closing the distance between them, pulling her into his arms with a gentleness that made her throat tight. "Are you happy?" he asked against her hair. "I don't know," Eliza admitted. "I'm scared. My mother—" "You're not your mother. And you're strong, Eliza. Stronger than anyone I've ever met. Women die in childbirth. Strong women. Healthy women. And many more live through it and have healthy babies." He pulled back to look at her. "We'll get the best care. Dr. Harrison will monitor everything, and I'll be with you every step of the way. You can't be with me during the birth. That's not how it works. Then I'll be right outside the door, close enough to hear you curse my name for getting you into this situation." Despite her fear, Eliza laughed. "I might do that anyway." The pregnancy progressed normally through the summer and into fall. Eliza continued working as long as she could, though Caleb and Sarah conspired to keep her away from the more physically demanding tasks. By October, exactly a year since Caleb had first ridden onto her ranch, she was too ungainly to do much beyond light work and supervising. One afternoon, she and Caleb sat on the porch watching the sun set over land that had been transformed in 12 months. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. The horses ran in pastures with new fencing. The ranch house had been expanded again, this time to add proper bedrooms for the growing family they were building. "Do you remember this day last year?" Eliza asked. "Every detail. You standing on this porch, watching the bankmen inventory your life. The look on your face when I paid off the debt, like you couldn't decide if I was crazy or if you were dreaming. I thought you were crazy, Eliza admitted, paying $2,300 for someone you'd never even spoken to. Best money I ever spent. You didn't know that then. I knew enough. He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. I knew you were someone who'd fight for what mattered. That was worth betting on. Vernon Hastings had come by the ranch once, in early summer, ostensibly to check on the property's value for bank records. Really, Eliza suspected, to see if they'd failed yet. He'd found instead a thriving operation with healthy stock, good employees, and improvements that had significantly increased the land's worth. You've done well, he'd said, and couldn't quite hide his disappointment. We've done well, Eliza had corrected, emphasizing the plural. My husband and I. She'd taken particular pleasure in watching him ride away, knowing he'd have to report back to his superiors that the Hartley Mercer Ranch was not only solvent, but profitable. Some small, petty part of her hoped it stung. In December, as the first anniversary of Sage's difficult birth approached, Eliza went into labor. It was late afternoon, the winter sun already sinking toward the horizon, when the first contractions hit. Caleb sent Tom riding hell for leather to fetch Dr. Harrison and Sarah to stay with Eliza, while he paced the house like a caged animal. The labor was long, nearly 20 hours, but not complicated. Dr. Harrison monitored everything carefully, and Sarah stayed by Eliza's side, offering the kind of practical, unsentimental support that somehow helped more than empty reassurances would have. When the baby finally arrived, wailing and perfect, Dr. Harrison placed the infant in Eliza's arms and said, "You have a son, healthy as a horse by the sound of those lungs." Caleb was allowed in then, and the look on his face when he saw his son for the first time was something Eliza knew she'd remember forever. Wonder and terror and overwhelming love all mixed together. "He's perfect," Caleb whispered, touching one tiny hand with a finger that seemed impossibly large by comparison. "We did good work," Eliza said, exhausted but exhilarated. "You did the hard part. We'll call it even." They named him Samuel after Caleb's father. Samuel Mercer, born December 20th, 1887, on a ranch that had nearly been lost but had instead become the foundation of something lasting. The months after Samuel's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and steep learning curves. Eliza had thought she knew hard work, but caring for an infant while still recovering from childbirth tested her in entirely new ways. Caleb was as involved as propriety allowed, walking the floor with a colicky baby at 3 in the morning, changing diapers without complaint, taking night feedings when Eliza was too exhausted to function. Sarah proved unexpectedly helpful, having raised younger siblings back in Kentucky. She taught Eliza tricks for soothing fussy babies and managing the impossible juggling act of ranch management and motherhood. By spring, they'd found a rhythm. Samuel was sleeping through the night more often than not. Eliza was back to working at least part-time on the ranch, and the operation was running smoothly enough that they could occasionally take a day off without everything falling apart. One afternoon in May, Caleb came into the house to find Eliza nursing Samuel in the rocking chair her father had made for her mother. "I have news," he said. "Good or bad?" "Good. Very good. I just sold 3 yearlings to a buyer from California. He's starting a breeding program out there and wants our bloodline as his foundation stock." "How much?" Eliza asked, though she'd learned to read the answer in Caleb's expression. "Enough to pay off the last of our expansion costs and put a significant amount in savings. We're completely in the black, Eliza. No debt, healthy reserves, and orders coming in faster than we can fill them." She'd known they were doing well, but hearing it stated so plainly made it real in a way it hadn't been before. They'd actually done it, taken a failing ranch and turned it into a thriving operation in less than 2 years. "My father would be proud," she said softly. "He'd be awed. You took his vision and made it better than he probably imagined." "We did," Eliza corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Caleb settled into the chair across from her. "Remember when you were afraid of depending on anyone? Thought it made you weak? I was an idiot. You were scared. There's a difference." He paused. "But look at what we built because you were willing to trust. Not just the ranch, though that's impressive enough. But this," he gestured around them, "a family, a home, a life neither of us could have created alone." He was right. Everything good in Eliza's life now had come from that terrifying decision to accept help, to enter into partnership, to trust someone else with her dreams and her future. In June, Sarah came to them with her own news. She'd been courting Tom Briggs, something everyone on the ranch had noticed but politely ignored, and they wanted to get married. "I'll understand if you want to let one of us go," Sarah said. Ranch romances can complicate things. "Why would we let either of you go?" Caleb asked, genuinely puzzled. "You're both excellent at your jobs. What you do on your own time is your business." They married in July, a simple ceremony at the ranch, and Caleb and Eliza gave them the newly built cabin as a wedding gift. Having two married couples managing the ranch changed the dynamic again, but in good ways. Tom and Sarah brought a stability and long-term investment that single hands never quite matched. The years that followed brought the normal mixture of triumph and struggle that characterized ranch life. There were good years when the cattle prices were high and the horses sold quickly, and lean years when drought or market fluctuations tested their resilience. They lost animals to disease and accident, celebrated births, and mourned deaths. Samuel grew from an infant to a toddler to a small boy who followed his father around the ranch like a shadow, already learning the work that would one day be his. When he was 3, Eliza gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, for the amazing grace that had saved them all. Grace was different from Samuel, where he was serious and methodical. She was wild and fearless, climbing things she shouldn't and riding horses before she could barely walk. She reminded Eliza painfully of her own mother, that same indomitable spirit that refused to be confined by convention. By the time a decade had passed since that October day when Caleb had ridden in to save her ranch, Eliza sometimes had to stop and marvel at how completely her life had transformed. The Hartley Mercer Ranch was known across 3 territories as the premier source for working horses with stamina and intelligence. Their cattle operation, while smaller than some, was profitable and growing steadily. They'd bought the adjacent property when it came up for sale, expanding their grazing land. They'd built a proper bunkhouse for seasonal workers, a separate barn for the breeding stock, a schoolhouse for the children that also served other ranch families in the area. But more than the physical expansion, Eliza treasured the life they'd built within it. Samuel, now 10, was already showing his father's methodical patience and his mother's horse sense. Grace, 7, could outride children twice her age and had opinions about cattle breeding that occasionally made Tom laugh in surprise. One evening in late October 1896, Eliza and Caleb sat on the porch as they'd done hundreds of times before. The children were asleep inside. The ranch was quiet except for the normal night sounds of animals settling and wind moving through the grass. 10 years, Eliza said quietly. Almost to the day, Caleb agreed. October 15th was the foreclosure date. I can barely remember being that terrified woman standing on this porch watching the bankmen take inventory. I remember her. She was magnificent, scared but not broken. That's what made me certain. Certain of what? That you were worth saving. That this ranch was worth saving. That betting everything on a stranger was the smartest gamble I'd ever take. Eliza leaned against her husband's shoulder, comfortable in a way she'd never imagined being with another person. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't shown up that day? Sometimes. You'd have lost the ranch, probably ended up working in town somewhere, maybe eventually married someone safe and boring. And you? Would have kept searching for land, probably found something eventually, but it wouldn't have been this. Wouldn't have been you. We got lucky, Eliza said. We got brave, Caleb corrected. Lucky is when things fall into your lap. Brave is when you take a risk on something that matters. We both did that. You by accepting partnership, me by offering it. Everything else came from hard work. He was right, as he often was. Luck might have brought him to her ranch on that specific day, but everything that followed had been choice and commitment and stubborn determination to make it work. A door opened inside and Samuel appeared, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Mama? I had a dream about Grandfather, the one who built this ranch. Eliza's throat tightened. Samuel had never met his grandfather, but they talked about him often, keeping his memory alive through stories. What did you dream? She asked. He said to tell you he's proud, that you made his dream bigger and better than he imagined. Samuel yawned. Is that silly? No, sweetheart, Eliza said, tears in her eyes. That's not silly at all. After Samuel had been tucked back into bed, Caleb found Eliza standing in her father's old study, looking at the breeding records that stretched back 30 years. Her father's handwriting filled the early pages. Her own hand took over in the middle, and now Caleb's additions appeared regularly as well. Your father really would be proud, Caleb said from the doorway. I know. I just wish he could see it, could meet his grandchildren, could know that everything he built wasn't lost. Maybe he can see it. Who knows what's possible? Caleb came to stand beside her. But even if he can't, his legacy is right here, in these books, in those horses, in our children who'll carry on the work. That's immortality of a kind. Eliza closed the record book gently. When Samuel's old enough, he should learn to keep these records, keep the tradition going. And Grace? Grace, too. She's got a mind for cattle that shouldn't be wasted just because she's a girl. They'll both learn everything, and they can decide for themselves what role they want to take. Your father would approve of that, too, Caleb said. He raised you to run this place, after all. They walked back to their bedroom, the house quiet around them, and Eliza thought about how this space had changed over the years. It had been her parents' room, then hers alone after they died, then theirs together when she and Caleb married. Now it was the heart of a home that held not just them, but their children, their employees who'd become friends, their dreams that had become reality. In the morning, Eliza woke to find Caleb already up, standing at the window looking out over the ranch. She joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind, and together they watched the sun rise over land they'd fought for and won. What are you thinking? She asked. That I'm grateful. For all of it. The good years and the hard ones, the successes and the failures, every moment that brought us here. Even the broken leg? Even that. Because it taught us we could handle crisis together, that we could take care of each other when it mattered most. Samuel appeared at their door, Grace right behind him, both children ready for breakfast and the day's adventures. Eliza and Caleb exchanged a look that held 10 years of partnership, of love tested and proven, of dreams built together from nothing but faith and stubborn determination. They went downstairs as a family, and Eliza started breakfast while Caleb got the children started on their morning chores. Through the window, she could see Tom and Sarah heading to the barn, could see the cattle grazing in the distance, could see horses running in pastures her father had fenced decades ago. This was her life now, not the one she'd expected, perhaps, but infinitely better than anything she could have planned. She'd lost everything once, parents, security, the certainty that hard work alone would be enough. And in losing it, she'd found something infinitely more valuable. She'd found partnership, love, family, a future built on trust instead of fear. Later that morning, after breakfast was cleared and the children were at their lessons, Caleb found Eliza in the barn checking on a mare who was close to foaling. I was thinking, he said, maybe it's time to make this official. Make what official? The ranch name. We've been calling it the Hartley Mercer Ranch informally, but the deed still just says Hartley. Should probably change that. Make it clear this belongs to both of us. Eliza considered. Her father's name on the deed was the last official connection to him, the final acknowledgement that this had been his first. But holding on to the past didn't honor it. Building on it did. Yes, she said. Let's do that. The Hartley Mercer Ranch, officially and legally. They rode into town the next week and filed the paperwork. The clerk barely blinked. Everyone in the territory already knew them as the Hartley Mercer operation anyway. But seeing it written officially, both their names claiming ownership equally, felt like closing one chapter and beginning another. On the ride home, Caleb said, "You know what I've never done?" "What?" "Properly thanked you." "For what?" "For saying yes. For taking a chance on a stranger, for building this life with me even when you were terrified." "I should be thanking you," Eliza protested. "You saved everything." "We saved each other," Caleb interrupted. "You gave me a place to belong, a purpose beyond just surviving and saving money, a family. That's worth more than any debt I paid." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the autumn sun warm on their faces, the landscape familiar and beloved. "Caleb," Eliza said finally. "Yeah?" "I'm glad you showed up that day. I'm glad you were crazy enough to pay off a stranger's debt. I'm glad for all of it, the partnership, the marriage, the children, the life we built, every single piece. Even when I drive you crazy, especially then, means you care enough to be annoying. He laughed, and the sound filled Eliza with a contentment so complete it was almost overwhelming. This was what her father had wanted for her, she realized. Not just a successful ranch, but a full life. Love, family, purpose, partnership. She'd found all of it, and more besides. As they crested the last hill before home, the ranch spread out before them in all its hard-won glory. The house her father had built expanded now to hold a growing family. The barns and corrals and pastures, improved and maintained with care. The cattle and horses, the fruit of years of careful breeding and dedication. And standing in the yard watching for their return, two children who represented the future of everything they'd built. Samuel waved when he spotted them, and Grace started running toward the road, heedless of the dust and her mother's certain disapproval of her wild behavior. "Our daughter has no fear," Caleb observed. "She gets that from you." "Me? I'm cautious." "You paid $2,300 for someone you'd never met. That's not cautious." That wasn't fearlessness. That was certainty. I knew what needed to be done, so I did it. Eliza thought about that as they rode the last distance home. Maybe that was the real lesson of these 10 years. Not that fear wasn't real or valid, but that certainty about what mattered could overcome it. She'd been terrified the day she accepted Caleb's partnership offer. Terrified when she agreed to marry him. Terrified through every birth and loss and crisis they'd faced. But underneath the fear had been certainty. Certainty that this partnership mattered. That this love was worth protecting. That this life they were building deserved every ounce of courage she could muster. They dismounted in the yard, and Grace crashed into Eliza's legs with the full force of a 7-year-old's enthusiasm. "Mama, come see! The mare had her baby!" "Which mare?" Eliza asked, though her heart was already racing. They'd had 3 due within the week. "The one Papa said was special, the granddaughter of Ranger." Eliza and Caleb exchanged a look and hurried to the barn. There, in the stall they'd prepared, stood a mare with a newborn filly beside her. And the filly was perfect. She had Ranger's distinctive build, her dam's intelligent eyes, and a coat that shone even in the dim barn light. "She's the one," Eliza whispered, knowing without question that this was the horse that would take their breeding program to the next level. "Papa would have loved her." "What should we name her?" Samuel asked, appearing at Eliza's elbow. Eliza looked at the filly, at her children, at her husband, at the barn her father had built, and she'd expanded. At the life that had nearly been lost but had been saved and transformed into something neither she nor her father could have imagined alone. "Hope," she said. "We'll call her Hope." Because that's what this whole journey had been about, really. Hope that hard work would pay off. Hope that people could be trusted. Hope that love was worth the risk. Hope that what was broken could be mended, what was lost could be found, what seemed impossible could be achieved through partnership and persistence and faith. That night, after the children were asleep and the ranch was quiet, Eliza and Caleb sat on the porch one more time. The stars were brilliant overhead, the air crisp with the promise of winter, the land peaceful around them. 10 years ago today, Caleb said, I rode onto this ranch as a stranger and changed both our lives. Best decision either of us ever made, Eliza said. I'd do it again, Caleb said. Every bit of it, every hard choice, every crisis, every moment of doubt, because it all led here. To this porch, to this life, to you, to everything that matters. Eliza took his hand, lacing their fingers together the way they had hundreds of times before. You didn't just pay a debt that day, you know? No? No. You gave us a future, both of us, and we built it together piece by piece into something neither of us could have created alone. That's what partnership means, Caleb said softly. That's what love is. Two people building something bigger than either of them could manage solo. They sat in the darkness, holding hands, watching their land, living in the life they'd fought for and won. Somewhere inside, their children slept safely. In the barn, Hope, the filly who represented everything they'd achieved, nursed from her mother. Across the ranch, their employees rested, trusting that tomorrow would bring more honest work and fair treatment. This was what success looked like, Eliza thought. Not just financial stability or thriving operations, though those mattered, but this partnership, family, purpose, belonging. The knowledge that you'd taken something broken and made it whole. That you'd risked everything and won not just security, but joy. The dust storm that had rolled across these plains 10 years ago had carried away the woman Eliza had been, scared, alone, desperate. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who'd learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness, and that asking for help was sometimes the bravest thing you could do. She'd needed saving that October day, and Caleb had provided it. But he'd needed saving too, from a life of endless work without purpose, from the loneliness of having no place to belong, from the hollow victory of achieving goals that held no meaning. They'd saved each other. And in doing so, they'd built something that would outlast them both, a ranch, a family, a legacy of partnership and love. "I love you," Eliza said into the darkness. "I love you too," Caleb replied. "Now and always." And sitting there on the porch of the home they'd built together, surrounded by everything they'd fought for and won, Eliza knew with absolute certainty that this life, this love, this partnership was exactly what her father had hoped for when he'd first broken ground on this land so many years ago. Not just survival, but thriving. Not just endurance, but joy. Not just a ranch, but a home. They'd taken his dream and made it bigger, made it better, made it theirs, and they would pass it on to their children, who would add their own dreams to the foundation, building something that would last for generations. The cowboy had arrived as they were seizing her ranch. He'd paid every dollar she owed and sent them away. But more than that, so much more than that, he'd stayed. He'd partnered. He'd loved. He'd built. And together, they'd created a future worth every sacrifice, every struggle, every moment of doubt. This was their story. This was their triumph. This was home.